Okay, so, as we already started doing, we've been playing XenoBlade Chronicles as our game streams on weekends since the start of the year. And me doing that has been, for all intents and purposes, to fill in that gap with how I started to review the Xeno Series games, and then I got hit with massive burnout thanks to no one actually watching the videos I put all my time, passion, and effort into making, which discuss things about the Zentries that no one else bothers to bring up. And yes, I'm a bit bitter about that as well. No one talks about the things I bring up about them, which makes them worth watching, and yet I kept being told by my viewers, well, I didn't watch it because I want to go through the full thing myself. Kinda defeats the purpose of why the videos were made, doesn't it? What I discuss about the games isn't necessarily in the games themselves or is readily apparent about them, yet is relevant to enjoying them more or at least understanding their problems legitimately. As you can imagine, that kills one's motivations horribly when one sacrifices personal time to put stuff like that out, and nothing to come from it. Couple that with screwy things happening in real life that have gutted my time for things I actually want to do, including but not limited to my asshole former general manager at work firing my roommates and then having to find different sources of employment which scuttered our collective earnings, and yeah, it's been a few bad years. Which is why we're down to just streaming weekly with the occasional more scripted work, and move forward in more of this vloggy format. And if you're wondering why we're out here, yeah, my set has now been converted into a full-on display room for my metal kits and bigger collectibles, as well as a place where I can safely have my 3D printer set up without the fumes of melting plastic negatively affecting any of us. Speaking of which, yes, those Monados are 3D printed. That's how I have them. And yes, with time now no longer being spent on super long scripted works, don't look at the video length here, I'm instead learning 3D modeling to make what I want instead, because me making things is my relaxation hobby. But that begs the question of why we're starting to do streams of Xenoblade in lieu of reviews of it, instead of Xenosaga, which came before them, and you would think we would be doing to connect the entire Xeno series even if they're not all in the reviewy format. And there is a reason for that. Reasons that are backed up by this article from the Xeno Series fan site Xenoverse. I was sent a link to its Internet Archive Wayback Machine incarnation, which tells more about the behind-the-scenes of the game's development in the long article that was written about Xenogears, Xenosaga, and a little bit of Xenoblade 1 as this was released right as Xenoblade itself was releasing. Granted, because this was written around 2010, 2011-ish, I end up disagreeing with a fair amount of the article's opinionated assertions, as with time many of the writer's opinions have been shown to be less than credible, disproven, or outright disingenuous. Again, this piece was written like 15 years ago, so they didn't have all the information they might have had to make a better opinion than they had, but the factual basis behind the details of the Xeno series development is more credible as they cite their sources about that information. But, as I said, there's a reason I'm not going to stream Xenosaga, and that reason is, I already played and recorded footage of Xenosaga, and I don't want to do it again. Let's not beat around the bush with this, people. The Xeno series took until Xenoblade 1 to actually be good, with the exception to Xenoblade still having problems, at times, with actually explaining its essential need-to-know elements properly. And as evidenced by the article, a lot of these issues are not entirely the creator's fault, as it all starts from Xenogears and the lessons not learned from that game's production. Now, with exception to placing more blame than I should have on Final Fantasy VIII, what I said about Xenogears Origins in my original Xenogears review is mostly correct and in line with what the Xenoverse article itself says. The Xeno series creators Tetsuya Takahashi and Kaori Tanaka, known under her pen name of Soraya Saga, had started to become dissatisfied by the repetitiveness of the existing Final Fantasy games they had worked on. They met while working at Square, and they subsequently dated as well as collaborated on the premise for a revolutionary game of their own, which they presented to their bosses. Both of them were science fiction fans, with Soraya having stuck in her head the idea of a protagonist suffering from having multiple identities created as a consequence of psychological traumas, whereas Takahashi had everything that was tied to exploring themes found from outdated religions as means by which to explain the subjugation of man. Their presented story lost out to Hironobu Sakaguchi in what would become Final Fantasy VII, simply because their draft was far more difficult to understand, due to the density of their narrative making the purpose and direction of it nigh incomprehensible to parse, and such done to an unnecessary degree as the pair were completely incapable of simplifying their ideas in a way that an outsider to them would be able to grasp correctly what was meant. At least not without a lot of footwork into the various areas where Xenosaga and Tetsuya Takahashi found their interests. Whereas Hironobu Sakaguchi's presentation of ideas of lost identity, corporatocracy, toxic capitalism, and existentialism was more direct, emotionally connective, universally understandable, as they are relatable from multiple viewpoints and experiences, and less abstract than what Takahashi and Saga had themselves proposed. While Takahashi blamed it on how dark his narrative is that such was rejected, that assertion ignores that Final Fantasy VII is plenty dark in its narrative as well. It just isn't hopelessly edgelord about its cinematic narrative.
That wasn't a movie, that was a snuff film.
The actual problem with Xenogears, as I said in my review, is the story overcomplicates and poorly explains itself, taking something that could be easily related to the audience, and makes the delivery far worse and unnecessarily more incomprehensible, and thus giving it a much higher barrier to entry and appreciation than multiple other pieces of media that explore or exploit those same concepts and ideals. Whereas Final Fantasy VII follows the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. You lay the foundations in a way the audience can connect to, and then you build upon it to achieve a complex structure. When you start hitting someone out of the gate with solid, impenetrable lore, followed by large gaps of progression where nothing of substance is added, only to hit them over the head again with more densely packed lore and events to advance the plot, it's going to be more difficult to grasp for the layman than something seeded out more evenly, even with Xenogears not being given the time to properly complete the game factored in, as not everything that was relevant and important to telling the story was actually there or being correctly focused upon. Like, I consider myself a fairly intelligent person. I actively engage with the media I seek out and pay attention to what they do to grasp their narratives. I engage with supplementary material and paratextual information others do not seek out. And Xenogears, even with me having knowledge of Gnosticism and Jungian psychology that the pair like to exploit, being aware of 2001: A Space Odyssey, Soylent Green, Gundam, and basically the laundry list of Takahashi's story influences because they are things I appreciate as well, I was getting lost at points and had to go back over details that didn't narratively connect inside of the story, or had events hinge on things I never saw when I played, even when I had their big lore book and the Xenowikis to cross-check and provide the necessary details the game itself was not presenting or not presenting well. Hell, that Xenoverse article? It makes some mistakes in its listing of several of those influences, as do the Xenowikis as they're not looking at them properly. The biggest one is continuing on with the mistaken assumption that a lot of people used to make with Xenogears, of it sharing Evangelion's references to Jewish and Christian mysticism, when they are in fact making Ultraman references. Yes, if you didn't see my Xenogears video, this stuff with the crucified units is an Ultraman reference, not a Christianity one or an homage to Evangelion. Takahashi has made clear with later works it was always that way, as he keeps making Ultra Series references throughout the Xeno series, and even planned the blades of XenoBlade 2 to be more like Ultra Series Titans by virtue of all their core crystals, mimicking the functionality and placement of the Ultra Series color timers. Can anyone beyond size fetish fan artists imagine a timeline where Pyra, Mithra, and Numa were all presented as giant women? At least more than the height advantage they already have on young Rex. For everyone who played Xenoblade 3 knows he grew like a weed after the events of their game. And all of Evangelion's Christian religious symbolism was last-minute substitutions into that series' storyboards because Evangelion was originally meant to be a sequel to Nadia and the Secret of Blue Water, and everything involving angels were in fact a malfunctioning terraforming system created by a precursor race. And thus the religious symbolism has no actual purpose or meaning at all in that franchise either. Nor do they have purpose or meaning in Xenogears, despite Xenogears more deliberately trying to invoke the point of that organized religion is a lie symbology in order to trick people into worshipping false deities.
False god. Dead false god.
But then again, that article was written in the early 2010s, and Ultraman's influence in Japanese pop culture when it comes to sci-fi works wasn't the most known back then by Westerners, beyond the publication of Hayao Miyazaki's regular slander of science fiction. And thus, what they were intending to cite can end up completely miscredited. So, we'll mulligan that mistake on the author's part, and the article's similar claims that Evangelion is deconstructionalist instead of just plain nihilistically destructive. and what series were required to put them back together. Remember this point, we'll be swinging back to it later. But regardless of all that and the myriad of other referential works I caught and understood that others don't, Xenogears is effectively impenetrable to most people. And even difficult for me to get despite all of that media awareness on my part to be familiar with what they're trying to do because it is not told well. Oh, I saw what the game was doing in its broader strokes. It was not lost on me. But it is bogged down incessantly by distractions irrelevant to the message it wants to give and as a consequence of how they don't build the story well, nor use our time in the setting effectively at all. I wasn't on board or invested in it because of the poor delivery and lean into the ideas it was presenting on its own terms. I was bringing my knowledge from outside the game in order to understand the premise it had as its central themes and direction. But I shouldn't need to do that. The game should be able to deliver that itself without needing to bring in a supplementary level of knowledge. When Persona 5 used the demiurge from Gnostic mythology, though labeling it under a name I cannot pronounce, that's why I call it by its alternative name of the demiurge, that's easy to understand inside of the game, because it is serving the same role internally within the story as it would in its mythology of origin, without needing to know about its mythological role. You can infer that by how the demiurge acts in the story and what it is responsible for, at least if you're acting in good faith towards the narrative. In the same way, the other chosen demons of sin and primary persona of the game were chosen to inform the characters they are attached to. And for those who don't know any of that, I did that analysis in my Persona 5 reviews in 2024. Please watch that video set. And it's only idiots that ignore these narrative elements that need to be told. Literally the purpose of this thing being included is for it to do the thing it mythologically is known to be doing. Whereas the entity that serves the same Gnostic role as the demiurge equivalent in Xenogears, Deus, is more abstract in its servitude of that role, as everything bad it causes is more attributable to its proxy servant that acts as its mouthpiece, alongside the actual central villain of the game that doesn't even involve them. It's a disconnected, disassociated antagonist. I've seen Sentai and Kamen Rider series where the point of them is to revive their big bad guy, where the big bad has less screen and story presence than Deus does, yet feels like it has a more active, involved role. But yeah, I shouldn't have to bring in outside knowledge into a game to be able to understand what it's supposed to be doing. It should be capable of presenting that clearly itself. Nor should I have to read the supplementary material book released months after the game, only in Japan by the way, to be able to understand the creator's intended story.
After all, if you need supplementary material in order for people to understand your movie, then you are failing as a filmmaker.
And that's even before getting into Squaresoft's bullcrap, which, to be fair to the production staff, were not making things any better. Barely any budget, a small production team, that production team being cannibalized to help other ongoing projects, and larger focus placed on getting Parasite Eve, Final Fantasy VIII, and a Chocobo game done. Yeah, Xenogears was strangled in its sleep, so half the game couldn't even be completed. And yet the incomplete section of the game is where it actually got better for me than the first half. That was a poorly handled, poorly told slog. However, I don't think it would have gotten to that point if Takahashi and Saga's ambition had not exceeded their capabilities, and they actually managed to slim their game down so what they had was more understandable and easily delivered. Square passing on making their draft the would-be Final Fantasy VII should have been assigned to go over their plans again, revise them, and making them more audience-friendly. Not necessarily screwing over what their plans were for the lowest common denominator, but making it so more people would be accepting of what they were doing and not being turned off by just how heavily it was sledgehammering you with things they thought you needed, but could have been told in different, better presented ways. As not everyone out there is going to be into all of this stuff. Not everyone is in their head enough to understand their work from Takahashi's own frame of reference. Yet a well-presented narrative can act as one's entry point into enjoying such material even without going down the bullet points of, oh, this came from X, so we have to apply external knowledge from X to understand this plot point Y in its proper context in order to get to resolution Z. Such supplementary knowledge can accent one's enjoyment of a series or medium, but it should not need to be a replacement for proper storytelling. If anything, it should make one interested in other works or what acted as their inspirations. I got into Japanese tokusatsu works because I started as a fan of Power Rangers and the rest of Saban's adaptations of toku material, so I'd eventually seek out the original works. Star Wars, Star Trek, and Back to the Future were my entry points to grander views on science fiction. Everyone has to start with this stuff somewhere, and it's far more difficult to get one on board such abstract concepts when one won't even define their terms. I should not need a checklist of things I need to have watched or played beforehand outside of a franchise in question to be able to understand just this single, individual thing. Hell, I've talked about crossover games where their appeal is that you can get into something just from playing that game. And yet my knowledge and precedent experience with all this other media that inform and originate Xenogears make, if anything, made my appreciation of the game worse because I could see where it was coming up short in comparison to any of its influences or originating premises without really claiming an identity or unique niche of its own. So, yeah, Xenogears sold less than 900,000 units in Japan and less than a third of that internationally, meaning it failed to meet the minimum sales goal Squaresoft set for it due to how impenetrable the game overall was. And likely almost sold that many on Square's reputation, as Square sells a lot of its games on the image of it being a quality brand, even when the games they sell are absolutely awful. Xenogears has a cult-like worship of it by fans, but I am not one of them, and it is not an uncommon critique that the game is unnecessarily difficult to understand due to it not explaining itself, even by those with pre-existing knowledge of what it is trying to do. And that's likewise disregarding the standard collection of PlayStation 1 control jank, leveling difficulties, party rotation limitations, and navigation issues I had with the game. It has aged poorly. There's no way around it, even when disregarding how the game shipped incomplete with just summarization plastered over what they couldn't get ready. The Xenoverse article goes more into it than I intend to here, and if you're at all interested, well, look it up in the Wayback Machine yourselves, as it goes into a lot of what the game intended to do, but didn't succeed in making its narrative point intelligible, even to those with pre-existing context to what it's going for. Though again, the article more makes excuses for the ambitions of the staff than finds their faults. Like, the writer compared Takahashi with the Xeno series to George Lucas and Star Wars, but a major flaw in the reasoning in the article is, Lucas might not trust his writing and not think he's a good writer, but Lucas has always been self-aware of that, and whenever possible he got his work critiqued and peer-reviewed to make it better, or collaborate with someone more competent than himself when it came to writing characters and dialogue. The only reason that didn't happen with the Star Wars prequels was because everyone he asked to help him, as he knew he needed it, thought that Lucas didn't need their input to do well when he genuinely did. Star Wars Episode 1 and the messier parts of Episodes 2 and 3 are the consequence of him not getting that constructive feedback when he asked. And yes, that will be coming back up later. Whereas Takahashi and Saga, with Xenogears, it feels like, with everything else going on, they didn't take the time they needed to refine what they wanted to do in order to make their narrative actually work how they wanted. So the big picture just isn't there, and the bite-sized pieces feel largely aimless beyond the actions of the bad guy. To not acknowledge that and the other faults is to not see where things need to improve if they were going to do more. And despite the jabs at George Lucas in the article being undeserved, well, another thing the Xenoverse thesis does bring up that puts it in parallel to Star Wars is just the sheer toxicity and cult-like behaviors of the Xenogears fans when it comes to proclaiming that specific entry the best thing ever, when even in its era, Xenogears was far from even charting for that acclaim. Though I can understand some of the cult-like worship for a game that just didn't find the audience to be as widespread as it needed to be a success. Like, I'm a .hack fan, and GU is my favorite game, period, and its development company, CyberConnect, still considers GU their most successful game narratively, with only the recent works with Fuga Melodies of Steel rivaling it. But I'm not going to delude myself into saying it's the best thing ever, or without places it could be improved. Or counterintuitively, where it was undermined by other horrible works that took away from what its strengths were. I know its niche completely as consequence of its story engines and where it sets its story, and my largest defenses of it are based in how, unsurprisingly, people didn't pay attention to what the story was actually doing as they don't see the forest for the trees. But I bring it up as often as I have for the last decade because it is a game that is ridiculously clairvoyant in how it does many of the same things other series I compare it to want to do themselves before those later series would see release. and I find what I compare it to wanting because these other games and series make massive screw-ups in these common areas to zig where .hack zagged and didn't fall into them, or where the series itself was influential towards other later works. Oh, and yes, we're coming up on another of them in this whole production, which finally brings us to Tetsuya Takahashi and Soraya Saga leaving Squaresoft and forming the Monolift Software on October 1st of 1999. The pair had in the perfect works for Xenogears the prior year teased some of their conceptual plans for Xenogears 2, but with Square considering the original game a financial failure, the company balked at doing another one. So instead, with the cult-like fanaticism for an unfinished game, they and over 50 Square employees, many of whom were part of Xenogears development, jumped ship to the new company. They were able to take so many, as, like the pair, the others had become just as disenfranchised by how Square was running things, and their production priorities being based around self-sustaining IPs, not leaving much room for innovation or money for new ideas to be fully developed. And while they're not wrong on that, one only needs to look at how much liquid cash is spent by Square on over-designing the graphics of their games, instead of settling on a unified art style that is far less costly than making almost lifelike character models and renders, which makes it so even successful game sales don't earn a game's production budget back, such as happened with Final Fantasy XVI and the 7 Remake productions. And thus, there is a clear lack of self-reflection on why Xenogears didn't do as well as it could have. Again, my life-changing game franchise is niche, but I've also chronicled how horribly it was marketed outside of Japan to make it far less successful than it could have been. Whereas Square titles to this day get the red carpet treatment by comparison, or even crap titles sell millions by solely brand recognition and basically no marketing. So to not meet that pedigree does say a lot. Again, Square only wanted 1 million in sales in their key target demographic of their home country. They didn't get close. But this is where Namco, just before the fusion dance with Bandai to become Namco Bandai, enters the picture. Namco executive Masaya Nakamura gave the fledgling Monolift Soft a chance and helped the company get financing as a secondary developer for the company, doing budget work for them on other projects while they developed their own. This isn't uncommon in the Japanese game industry, with assistive work being farmed out to multiple companies under a larger brand. CyberConnect has helped Square on multiple projects before breaking from them more permanently due to the frustrations of Final Fantasy VII's remake project. And Monolift Soft, after being bought out by Nintendo, has also served that role for multiple Nintendo games, including some of the most recent Zelda entries. But with Namco and this other work coming in, it allowed Monolift Soft to build their foundations, and despite Xenosaga's first premises coming together as Project X as early as 1998, it wasn't until 2000 the development actually began on the game series, as the company both needed to staff up and develop their talent pool, and a larger group of people to work on the game and more time to craft its story. That should resolve the production crunches Xenogears was clearly under to make a better product. And it did. Takahashi and Saga taking until 2002, more than twice as long as they had developed Xenogears in total, to complete what would become Xenosaga Episode 1, Duril Zermatt, released in 2002 in Japan and 2003 in the West. And it was a good game for its era. And I mean that sincerely. This was a good start despite some jankiness expected of RPGs on the PS2, as I am capable of judging games in accordance with their release era and not necessarily against modern standards. Hell, I still go back to play old games I enjoyed over new things, and advocate for recollections of old games with just some quality of life improvements added to them. Xenosaga 1 was the 17th highest selling video game in Japan in 2002, and considering 2002 was stacked with good games released, between the Hoenn region Pokemon games, Onimusha 2, Samurai's Destiny, Kingdom Hearts, Ratchet & Clank, half the iMock.hack games, The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, Super Robot Wars Impact, Super Mario Sunshine, Mega Man Zero, Mega Man Battle Networks 2 and 3, and the GameCube re-release of Sonic Adventure 2 Battle? Well, there's no shame amongst all of those other games in taking 17th. The key to that kind of placement was whether word of mouth on a game led to sales retention and kept the audience engaged enough for the following installments. And even for the short time I played it as a kid when a friend of mine brought over the game for the day, I really did like what it did and was setting up. It immediately resolved my issues I had with Xenogears and that I didn't connect with the cast when I played it again for purposes of recording footage for it, by giving me characters and arcs I could easily latch onto and through them explore this futuristic setting. And that's kind of a thing that's never been brought up much in the RPGs I play for the show. I actually tend to like more futuristic set RPGs, but I rarely come across any that actually appeal to me, nor any of them of the format I want in my top 10s. The closest I usually get are urban fantasy, steampunk, or post-apocalyptic reverted tech settings like Persona, Dot Hack's in-game setting, or Final Fantasy X, respectively. What I like is more in the vein of the Star Ocean setting, but I genuinely do not like how those games play or the stories of the ones I have tried out have gone. And it's something that's frustrated me for years, how I rarely actually get the setting I want in a way that appeals to me. Hell, one of the reasons I got so pissed off in Final Fantasy XIII was it was just correctly in that setting niche I wanted. It's just the story and failure to properly explore its setting that entirely sucked. But with the likes of Final Fantasy X and other PS2 RPG contemporaries like Dot Hack, Wild Arms, Disgaea, Kingdom Hearts, and the Tales series among others, it was going to be a hard sell to keep the momentum on the console going, especially with all the other game genres that got attention and hooked players into the PlayStation 2 with a diversity of good games for it, unless they could get people hooked on the setting and characters to keep going into the subsequent entries of the game. Xenosaga becomes the story of main heroine Shion Uzuki, voiced in English by Leah Sargent in the first and third games. We'll get to that later. In Episode 1, she's the lead administrative researcher for the company Vector Industries, who are developing Cosmos, a gynoid weapons platform designed to combat the threat of the Gnosis, a ghost-like apparition phenomena which intrudes on the material universe from higher-order dimensional space. Cosmos is able to combat them because their platform is capable of emitting an energy field that would force the Gnosis to take corporeal form that could then be fought, and the number of devices capable of radiating the field is, for some reason, limited currently. But the entire issue of the Gnosis that requires something artificial to emit this field is the Gnosis themselves are able to, through simple contact with them, distort and bioform other life forms into more Gnosis, slowly spreading like a plague, and happening without understandable rhyme or reason. Except that is, for one. I'll say it again, as I've learned this is not my joke. You do not mess with the Zohar, and Vector Industries, which employs Shion, is one of the few groups in the setting, including both a religious cult that has taken over a fleet of migrant space travelers, and an executive of the galactic government, have their own intentions for the Zohar. And worse, there are multiple Zohars in this setting. As in decades past, researchers found the Zohar and experimented to replicate its properties, creating 12 Zohar emulators. And not knowing when enough was enough, said researchers who were backed by these special interest groups tore open a rip in reality to try and gain power from Udu, the nebulous god entity that Xeno Series likes to use as its stand-in for capital G God. And it backfired. Worse, not all the researchers knew about this. Some thought they were trying to find a means to accessing the afterlife through which to call back the dead into artificial bodies called Realians. The largest representative of this being Momo, another one of the main characters, who was meant to be the reincarnated body of her creator's daughter, only for said creator to be the scapegoat for the entire affair that let loose the Gnosis on the universe. For as is eventually revealed, the plan to rip open a path to the afterlife, yeah, that worked, but they weren't actually the ones to first do it. The Gnosis are in fact actual ghosts. Ghosts twisted into grotesque monstrous forms by human spirit resistance to joining in the peace of the collective unconsciousness, who instead haunt the living and given a pseudo-corporeal form thanks to the researchers and the religious fanatical cult that funded them trying to usurp and kill God. Because of course that never, ever, ever works. And as a consequence of their arrogance, the Gnosis' presence in the universe is collapsing the dimensional space that humanity exists in, and slowly dragging it into the twisted, higher-order dimensional imaginary space, because the rift the researchers opened never fully closed. And in fact, it's been open for far longer than even that experiment as well, as there's one that came before even that. Which makes several of the game's later assertions just plain outright wrong, and I want the Xeno Series fandom to freaking acknowledge that. But because Monolift just cannot seem to escape its Final Fantasy influences, it's easy to say that this initial premise for the game series comes off as a more space opera sci-fi spin on Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. A version of Spirits Within that maybe had a few more rounds with the script doctor to fix how generic the story comes across as. I'll admit it's been forever since I've seen that movie, though I do own a DVD copy of it, which I got on clearance. I just remember it not being good, and its focus spent on overdeveloped CGI graphics at a time where CGI animation was expensive as hell for things of half Spirit Within's visual quality, which is telling where Square would eventually run its business into the ground. I don't blame Hironobu Sakaguchi for the screw-ups there as much as I blame the general shift at Square to graphics are everything, blow up the budget to get the graphics to near real quality. And as I've said time and again, a good art style for a game is more important than trying to make it look hyper-realistic. Unnecessarily overdeveloped graphics and modeling is the second largest waste of money in video games, right behind executive compensation packages. Throughout Episode 1, Shion and Cosmos have to escape the Gnosis coming for the Zohar emulator their ship comes across, which leads them into association with the rest of their party, a man named Chaos, who is in fact immortal and can destroy the Gnosis for reasons. The aforementioned Momo, a cyborg known as Ziggurat 8, aka Ziggy, who is hired to rescue and protect Momo as she has information multiple factions in the setting want. And Junior, an artificial human connected to the aforementioned experiments that was designed to kill Udu, which obviously did not work. I liked the combat system, how it and every character was customizable, as each weapon and accessory item had special abilities on them that a character over time could learn to have naturally without said item being equipped, on top of skills they could natively learn as well, which encouraged collection and retention of those items. The combat trees for attacks and buildable chains were better. Hell, if you did side quests, you could obtain the pieces to build your own summonable companion giant robot, the Erde Kaiser. And in the following two games, you can even acquire its successor units, the Dark Erde Kaiser Fury, and Erde Kaiser Sigma. Why does it have a face on its chest? Because it's cool! Well, that's, and it turns out that Takahashi and a lot of the other Xeno staff really liked 1997's King of Braves Gao Gaigar, as any cultural individual should. And retained from Xenogears was the capacity in some sections of the game to mount up and pilot more standard combat robots for dealing with large enemies. And I'll admit, while these sections weren't, well, Zone of the Enders or any given Gundam game in their sophistication, they were at least passable, for the most part, for an early 2000s game. The worst I'll say about them is, like was the issue with Xenogears, splitting the means of combat up between ground and mecha combat modes likely hamstrung developing both as time moved on, so neither is as good as they should have been, as the more time you spend on one, the less time you have to developing the other. The way to resolve that, which they should have taken, and other games have taken with such, is have the game systems fully translate the combat of one form of combat fully into the other, so the same mechanics can be used regardless of whether you are on the ground or in a mech, as then it's possible to reuse and further develop all assets simultaneously. But that's not what they did in Xenosaga, because they did not learn from the mistakes of Xenogears, and as a consequence, that is not what they did here. But what they did in Xenosaga 1 was fine enough if they were to iterate and improve on these systems to translate them directly into the next entries in the series. Spoilers! They did not do this. And every member here has a story arc to them, at least initially, which tie them all into these larger events about the Gnosis Siege, the mystery behind them and their emergence, and the various factions in play, all while the universe is being consumed slowly planet by planet, and the need to stop this all leading back to the worlds where these experiments all started, the worlds of Mcdom 4 Beta, and the place known as the Lost Jerusalem. And yes, the religious reference was deliberate, and going to spoil what the place is from the outset.
Oh my God, I was wrong. It was Earth all along.
Yeah, we'll swing back to that. But unfortunately this game was again falling prey to Takahashi's overambitions with regards to telling its story. Promotional material for just the first game included trailers for storylines and events that weren't going to be seen until Episode 2 because they were outright cut from the first game, alongside ones that would never be seen at all. has confirmed in the Xenoverse article, Xenosaga was initially planned to be told over 6 parts, the story divided into 6 narrative acts, and Episode 1 initially set out to be the first 15% of the story, which is why story material that was used in the second game appearing in trailers for the first game when it was first teased in 2001, a full year before the first game's story was finalized, is suspect in that regard. And Takahashi would later say that Xenosaga 1 is in fact closer to 20% of the tale. So even by the game's end, they were starting to pace and plan the tale better than a 6-year release schedule for the storyline, thinking they could possibly compress it to 5 or potentially even 4 games to be able to tell everything they needed properly for every character involved, with whatever was left potentially put into spin-off material that didn't need to be a numbered game. And Monolift Soft said in an interview in 2010 that they build out games as a skeleton with a broad base. So sometimes material they intend to use is developed out of chronological step with preceded material. Which seems a bit backwards, as if something earlier is changed or didn't work, they then have to scrap even more material and leave it on the cutting room floor to patch over such problems, as evidenced by there still being unused material from the original trailers. If it's meant in terms of, we build up the main story first and attach side stories to be told alongside the branching foundations of the primary tale, then that more reflects how things are done in regards to all of the XenoBlade games, an assortment of games outside this franchise that I do enjoy, where the stronger narrative foundations of the main story do in fact lead to equally strong and appreciated character and location stories unlocked over time. But for Xenosaga, that is not the same apparent case, and for one major reason which derailed the entire production from here on out. Xenosaga Episode 2, Genesis von Gott und Böse. Again, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and I genuinely do not care. Which, while we do not have complete sales information for sales outside of Japan, well, inside of Japan, Xenosaga 2 sold half of what Xenosaga 1 did, and every statement I've been able to find backs that up as consistent internationally. Now, you've heard me have problems with Xenogears, but Xenogears' primary issues are the gameplay, incomplete story, navigation issues, and the difficulty in penetrating its narrative by those unfamiliar with the ideas they are presenting, because Xenogears is not a game that is told well. Xenosaga 2, however... well, how do I put this delicately? Yeah, the only comparison I have is a sledgehammer. It's the Star Wars The Last Jedi of this franchise. Now, I hate that I can make such a layman comparison, but I make it because it's a simple one to make, and allows one to show that the vitriol shown towards that movie, while directed at the wrong things at times, and we have to call it the scumbags that make such bad faith arguments, is not unheard of in other franchises where they take an unexpected and contrarian turn, especially when it involves significant changes in staff, narrative direction, and characterization of the cast involved in it, as audiences get mad when that happens. So the hate towards Episode 8 is not necessarily founded from the allegations of assholes being sexist or racist or transphobic against Kelly Marie Tran, as any claims to those being the issue with the movie are invalid arguments on the box. They are not the problems with Star Wars Episode 8, you're being assholes about it when you think they are. The bases I'm talking about are the ones founded on the grounds of having those that take issue with narrative conflict, lore establishment, and character choices that are disagreed with and break anything else the story might be trying to do, and audiences not enjoying how the movie and its makers go out of their way to insult us for those issues. The acknowledgement of those faults keeps being obfuscated by the actual garbage takes from these sexist, racist, and bigoted idiots that draw attention to the wrong thing that are not the actual problems or a valid grievance with it. And thus, because valid complaints against the material got lumped in with the garbage and got discarded, it is unsurprising that all the issues that Disney Productions were developing never really got fixed, but spread to everything else they were doing. Like, Star Trek gets this too now, to be absolutely fair, where the problems of the modern stuff have nothing to do with race or sex or progressive ideals, but it's because they're just plain bad stories so much of the time. Or, as is exampled by their most recent pile of garbage, just plain spit in the face of the franchise's ideals by making out-and-out terrorists that had infiltrated and corrupted a more noble intended organization instead go out of their way to add legitimacy to their tyranny. Like, Trek and Wars have the same problem with almost all of their modern incarnations, corrupting what was there to make it appear or be depicted as worse than they were before, instead of finding and exploring legitimate faults or new ways to tell stories in its material. It's bad allegory, as if they're trying to say, stuff always sucked and was always like this, to compare it to America's crap, but in doing so, you miss the point of them and how they were supposed to have moved beyond the petty crap we do in the real world. Show us what we should strive toward to better ourselves and not fall into bad habits. And instead, the new wave of writers decided to just tear it down and say, no, don't strive to be better as this isn't actually better. Again, not realizing that it becoming worse wasn't a natural progression, but a whim of those writers. Which thus makes people hate the message as much as the messenger, and hate the messages that came before. It is our complete socio-cultural political discourse in pop culture wrapped down to a simple statement. Your messaging sucks! But back on points, this is also appropriate due to Star Wars' own influence once more on Takashi and the original game. It's to the point I've seen multiple Let's Players who do enjoy the Xeno series declare that Xenosaga 2 specifically is a game that no one should have to play. And I said a minute ago that each Xenosaga game was meant to be 15% of the story, with Episode 1 managing to clear about 20% of it. Yeah, that becomes the problem of Xenosaga 2. Said problem being... what story? Xenosaga 2 barely does anything at all beyond waste our fucking time. By count of what actually happens, only about another 5% of story actually happens in Xenosaga 2 because the game is paced that badly, and spends its time either ridiculously dragging out simple events that don't even get the explanation, or in cutscenes that, once again like Xenogears, summarize events and actions to not make them playable or relatable as they're not presented correctly. And what's worse is what's skipped over kinda needed more fleshing out than what was provided as an excuse, as a lot of what's summarized in a sentence just does not logically connect in why it happens that way. I legitimately spent twice as much time completing the side quests of the game, which were made mandatory to complete thanks to how bad the gameplay became in this entry, than I did actually doing anything to progress story-focused or relevant content. I played the game for 45 hours, and 30 of it was just on the side quests, with another 5 on just the opening goddamn area of the game due to how bad the leveling balance is that you get hit with a difficulty spike almost from the outset. And it's not even getting into what happens to the cast in there, in the remaining 10 hours actually played it, as quite literally every arc set up in the first game ends up almost entirely derailed, or deliberately echoed and repeated from the first entry, so they ultimately go nowhere and do nothing of value. It still ends up being 5% of the story, things still happen in the game that progress some of its narrative, but it is a hyper-minority of the overall content. Once you discount all these other distractions and the slow grind through levels, you only spend about 5% of this single entry focused on main story content. Yes, you only get 5% of the overall story from 5% of this single game. A large sector of which is tied to Junior's subplot with the entity Albedo, another artificial human with similar abilities to Junior's, and is obsessed with becoming one with Junior and their other similar brothers of theirs, though driven insane as a result of it, with the majority of their involved plot just being a search for a way to ultimately permakill the guy and explain why he's crazy. But as is the problem with the storyline from here on out, it fails to garner the empathy in the way it needed to fulfill this existential duality. The second branch of that being more elaboration on Momo and her creator, and the first major retconning of events of the original experiment to make clear that Momo's creator was scapegoated for it, even though they already got into that last time. It's information we had from the last game. We didn't need to make the entirety of the multiple playable stages to give us this previously provided information and a means of just repeating that info again, but as a collection of cutscenes and playable stages this time. We didn't need this. And the third branch of that being the introduction of the Xenosaga series' worst character and Shion's elder brother, Jin Uzuki. And I say he's the worst character because of one specific reason. Or rather, two of them. He knows everything already, and the game story is forcibly trying to write him as if he's the only character that is always in the right, despite him constantly making the objective wrong choices at literally every opportunity. And I don't mean he's a know-it-all character in the terms of him declaring "I told you so" that he is right, after catching his younger sister doing something wrong. Oh no, I mean the entire series of events that everyone else in the party is trying to discover the root causes to in order to stop things from getting worse? Yeah, Jin knows all of it already, and is refusing to reveal any of it to them, despite being fully capable of doing so. And because he doesn't, the rest of the cast are making mistakes and focusing on things they do not need to be, which is making things worse for them and shortening the span of time they have to focus and deal with these other issues, which makes all the diversions they're respectively suckered into entirely meaningless, because if Jin had actually talked to them about what he knew, they wouldn't have needed to make them.
どうしてもっと早く言わなかったの?
誰も聞かなかったからだ。
This is put in diametric contrast with Zatan from Xenogears, where Zatan had a good reason for holding back as much as he did, which was to protect his companions from the wrath of the Gazelle Ministry until such a time he could remove the means by which they had to control people. But Zatan's withholding of knowledge never, at any point in Xenogears, prevented him from helping the rest of the cast from making good, informed decisions. Jin does not have those justifications as an active obstacle towards those same pursuits. He was made aware of the events of the Zohar experiments and their true events, and caused by the Uzuki's parents right as everything was going to hell. He kept that knowledge to himself for no valid, excusable reason. Shion is revealed to have a hereditary medical illness in Xenosaga 3 that had not appeared nor was showcased at any point in any previous games. One she got from her mother that is likewise tied to the Zohars, which in Xenosaga 3 is starting to actively kill her. And yet Jin, despite having several years practicing as a doctor before giving it up, withholds all knowledge of the illness and their family's predisposition for it from her. She actually has to find out about it from her believed-to-be dead boyfriend that happens to be one of their antagonists, that she's dying. And the only reason her thought-dead boyfriend is one of their enemies is because he's actually trying to fucking save her from this preventable fate, which Jin is doing nothing to stop himself. And worst of all, the second Jin shows up, he's the one that takes the protagonist's reins away from Shion. He actively steals Shion's agency away from her, despite Xenosaga largely being her story, and Shion is then recharacterized from here on out to be an impulsive, petulant brat that's nowhere near as smart or capable as she thinks she is, or is presented as being in the first game, which is what required Cosmos to be her protector, instead of her camaraderie being a natural result of them fighting together once Cosmos became operational. The game instantaneously starts siding with Jin in literally all matters, even when he is demonstrably wrong, or his actions have intentionally been making things worse, or caused others to do things against their own self-interest because of what knowledge he has withheld.
Are you saying you don't care?
Don't be stupid. No brother wants to see his sister die.
You became a doctor to save her and then gave up entirely at the profession to run a shitty bookstore to save your own personal obsession for rare books and completely abandon all responsibilities to your fucking sister. That sounds like you don't give a damn and was happily letting her die. And you prevent her from going with the guy that is actively working to do the thing you fucking gave up on.
Completely pathetic.
Currently, Shion's mental balance is in an extremely unstable state. That is the likely cause of her attitude towards you.
Or maybe it's because Jin is literally the worst character in these games, and the writers keep turning every new revelation which he already knew into an excuse plot to prove Shion wrong, which doesn't work because Jin has no reason to have withheld the information he has been, that keeps making Shion have the wrong information to make her judgments with. Every time they do this, literally every time, we're not siding with him because of this. This, ladies, gentlemen, and others, is why I compared Xenosaga to the Star Wars sequel trilogy, because the commonality between the two is a theft of agency from the established characters to the newer ones that become involved in order to promote their importance, as opposed to said groups supporting each other and their divergent successor stories so they all gain purpose and merit. This is how Star Wars screwed up with Rey. It wasn't her gender or her being the new hotness, It was the absolute denial of successive legacy to take the better parts of what one learns from past generation, in this case Luke, and take what does work into a modern day to improve on and iterate to meet the needs of the now. Instead, they just chose to degenerate on Luke's story to make it so Rey's seemed better, because the way they left Luke's story is not in a way a lot of people were on board with. Especially because the Star Wars Legacy novels had shown Luke fixing the bigger problems of the Jedi Order and their stagnancy, which was part of why they fell originally in the prequel setting, as the prequels actually showcased. And again, as a point of comparison to show this isn't that difficult, I'm a Tokusatsu fan, and despite the demographic differences between the various franchises there, they managed to pull off such legacy succession stories on a regular basis, with it only being screwed up a hyper-minority of the time, or when the people in charge of it are just that big a bunch of smegheads to not really understand what they're dealing with. But none of that was helped by half of Xenosaga's cast changing voice actors in the second volume, and only the second volume of the story, as they were then later called back for the third. I've tried looking up why that happened, even back when Twitter was still a thing, reached out to Leah Sargent herself and the other voice actors affected by this, but none of them have any more of an answer now than they did back then. Even the Xenoverse article I'm citing is as clueless to why this happened as everyone else, as all the recasting that took place for episode 2 were undone and the original cast came back for the third and final episode. Oh, and the gameplay. The gameplay now completely and utterly sucks. Yes, it sucks across the board. Everything was redone for this one from the ground up. But now, this time, they added a stagger system where you need to attack an enemy enough to get past a guarding gauge to actually do any degree of decent damage to them. The problem is the stagger gauge is set too damn high, so battles now take for fucking ever. Again, I spent 2/3 of the game's playable length doing side quests that don't even matter to the story, but I am required to do just to get that little bit of extra gear that allows me to survive combat, which takes up the other 30% of the game. I did earlier say Xenosaga 2 only had 5% of the whole narrative story, and that really is because only 5% of the game, in fact, in any way relates to the story, instead of being some meaningless diversion and time sink you do only try and get to the next interesting or relevant thing. It's in all effect a filler story, as besides the new character introductions and the not death of one major antagonist, nothing of material value actually happens. And Xenosaga 3 starts so disconnected from the events of 2, you can generally skip from episode 1 to episode 3 and have nothing of essential importance be lost. This is why I brought up that jab against George Lucas from the Xenoverse article, as while Star Wars Episode 1 is felt as the most unnecessary of the prequel trilogy, things part of the longer narrative actually are set up and are built upon later in episodes 2 and 3. You can go full Machete watch order on it and skip it to just pick things up when Anakin's a young adult, but that's just starting the story later. You're not skipping the middle section of the tale to get a better story out of it. Which again, invites the Last Jedi comparisons. Exclude Rey meaning Luke from the end of episode 7, skip episode 8's butchering of his character, and episode 9 is still terrible, but the grievances take a different form than before because there is a more clear breakpoint through which to contrast executions as it's no longer held down by the baggage of the last one. Oh, and yes, Xenosaga 3 is the episode 9 in this narrative comparison. We'll get to that in a bit. For, with everything as well handled as it was in the first game, it's utterly baffling that things went as sideways as they did in the second. It makes one ask what Tetsuya Takahashi and Soraya Saga had been thinking in crafting the second part of the story, after all the time they'd spent getting the first part absolutely right. What with the character changes, gameplay changes, a new gameplay engine Adrenaline, completely new combat systems and mechanics, and all of it for the worse. It's almost as if they weren't the ones doing anything about any of that, and this was someone else's game entirely. And that's because it was. Monolith Soft's chief executive officer is a man named Hirohide Sugiura. Like Takahashi, Saga, and the other first staff members, he was a Squaresoft staff member that had become disillusioned with the tunnel vision Square had for their IPs. And because he was more of a corporate management type than a project director or writer, he took over as the representative for business matters, to look out for the company and well-being of their workers, make sure they can pay their bills and get projects out. At the time, Takahashi and Xenosaga were their hit product. The first entry did well by the metrics they wanted, and he was looking out for everyone involved, especially Takahashi, in wanting to allow Takahashi the freedom to act more as a creator than a project director. And so, Tetsuya Takahashi was asked to step down as creative head of the Xenosaga project.
This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move.
In an interview with Famitsu in 2003, Takahashi made the following statement. If you want to make a single game, that basically means you need to spend 2 or 3 years of your life completing it. However, with the world we're trying to display here, that's really nowhere near enough time. With episode 1, we've only managed to show about 20% of the complete scene. And of course, I always come up with new things I want to present in the middle of development, so it'd probably take me decades to finish everything if it keeps going like this. That's why I'm in the position I am now. I can work on presenting the world of Xenosaga in all sorts of different ways, unfettered by company management or anything else that doesn't have to do with creation. And that assertion ended up becoming true. It would take until 2023, with the release of Xenoblade Chronicle 3's Future Redeem DLC, a full 20 years later, for Molosoft to undo the damage and consequences of this mistake made in 2003. 2002, it was right around then. But not the other major one that occurred just after this. For with Takahashi's exit, Xenosaga 2's development was handed over to director Ko Arai, who had been an artist and stage designer on Xenogears, but had not directed before or after Xenosaga 2 any game to date. He is credited in that role on Xenosaga 3, but by and large Xenosaga 3 is considered to be Takahashi taking back the reins of the franchise to try and fix what was broken. And like Star Wars Episode 9, only making the mess even worse. But if that's not true and Arai was continuing in that role on 3, only just with more input from Takahashi, that would not surprise me either. Though Arai being moved into that position was not the second mistake made in Xenosaga's production. Oh no, it was just a component of it that set it off. The real second mistake made? That would be them firing Soraya Saga. Yeah. Now, as I said before, Takahashi has the same problem as George Lucas in that they need someone to take their ideas and work with them in order to develop them to their fullest potential, which requires time, effort, revision, and understanding of the person you are working with. And this is not that uncommon a thing to happen in the media industry, so frequently production of games, movies, and TV shows end up being a collaborative effort. We just usually simplify it down to the writer and the director and the producer because, well, the buck has to stop somewhere. And a husband and wife creative duo bring out each other's best? Yeah, that usually leads to good things as who will know you better and listen to you than a lifelong friend and spouse. We saw that with the Gundam Seed series. While that series gets more flack in the West simply due to the order of broadcast making Westerners not really understand what the point of the friggin' series was, it's one of the most successful Gundam series, period, because it was developed collaboratively by Mitsuo Fukuda and Chiaki Murasawa, lifelong friends who would eventually marry and become lovers, with Murasawa falling ill during the early production of Gundam Seed Destiny, which explains Seed Destiny's narrative issues with her unable to guide the scripting of it and requiring replacement writers take over who actually made a mess of that series and obfuscating the actual story direction. Murasawa's last creative work was written in 2006, with her dying in 2016, and Fukuda fighting for 8 years after her death to finally get his wife's final work, Gundam Seed Freedom, again, written in 2006, to screen, a full 15 years after it had been written, and it ending up the single most successful work Sunrise has ever made, all because Namco Bandai put their foot down over Sunrise executives stonewalling the project for over 15 goddamn years and got them to knock it off. I bring this up because Sunrise's mecha series are one of Takahashi's inspirations, and still influential even this deep into Xenosaga's make. So it's an important point of contrast and commonality, and also tells something about Bandai as well, which, yeah, there's a lot of people that insult Bandai for something coming up, which, no, that's inconsistent with the rest of what they actually do when they're not being slandered. Destiny as well ended up worse than it could have been, because Murasawa was no longer there to make clear Shin Asuka's character arc mimicked Anakin Skywalker's fall from grace. Once again, a commonality between creators as Fukuda and Murasawa are also notorious as Western sci-fi fans of the same things Takahashi liked, yet lacked his issues with the relation of stories. And Xenosaga itself went to crap, not because of anything Bandai was doing, but because it had been taken from both its original creators and turned into something that wasn't liked. Again, things like this in the media industry are not unknown to happen. It's just most people are not aware of franchises outside of the ones they're hyperfixated on to be aware that these recurrences do happen. And Xenosaga's replacement writer in turn, Norihiko Yonesaka, clearly didn't know what he was doing. He had written one game before this, the game Front Mission 3 for Squaresoft, with him also contributing to one side quest in Xenosaga 1. He was clearly inexperienced, and the issue with inexperienced writers is they can often end up not knowing what they're doing or what they're depicting within their works. Or worse, them ending up being yes men to the directors or producers who want to put themselves fully on the page without a filter. But, as I keep saying, intentionally, directors are not writers, nor should they be that intrusive to the writer's work unless it is an active, equal collaboration between them, which doesn't happen with the inexperienced. Between Takahashi and Saga, their mutual work clearly was collaborative, with Saga being able to interpret Takahashi to an extent, just not to the degree of delivery needed to make their material approachable to anything more than hyper-niche specific sci-fi nerds. They needed more time to revise things, and with Xenosaga 1, they had been getting that. But now, Takahashi was a step removed from the developmental process. You had an artist acting as a director that was outside of his wheelhouse of experience. Saga was gone against his will, and instead of the co-creators of the franchise, you had some newbie trying to go through everything and trying to figure out where to go next, and in all truth being set up to fail in that regard. All because the company's CEO didn't want to overwork and burn out their most essential talent, as it can so frequently happen in the video game industry with their horrific policies involving developmental crunch and burnout. This should be a poster child example of the road to hell is paved with good intentions, because Sugiura clearly did mean well in setting this all in motion. How was he supposed to know it would backfire so badly? He could not have. Yonesaka does not have a career after this game, at least one that is recorded anywhere I can find. And Arai went back to doing graphics art design work, but unfortunately the damage was done. And what was supposed to be Monolift's flagship IP had been run aground with its second entry. But the worst thing about all of this? None of the men that actually were responsible for this saw them properly blamed for such at the time. Instead, the cult of Xeno Series fans, removed from everything going on, especially if they were a Western fan of the Xeno series, well, they pinned all of the blame on Soraya Saga instead of those truly culpable for it. See, before this point, Saga was an active member of art sites such as DeviantArt and enjoyed interacting with fans on an international level of the works she was writing. She would on occasion even draw supplementary art for the Xeno series on the platform if asked, and published little unofficial companion comics for their works. But the second fans experienced Xenosaga 2 and saw her name was absent from the credits, well, they did what inevitably happens to most women on the internet, and was relentlessly harassed for it, as if she was responsible in any way for the game being crap because she abandoned it. Oh no, it couldn't be the new guys in charge of it. Clearly, the original creators didn't care, and we should tell them to unalive themselves for getting terminated from the franchise she was the co-creator of after her husband got all the credit for it. Again, as if my position was not clear already on this conduct, fucking grow up, you man-children! You can't fix a problem without knowing what the root cause of it was, as blaming the wrong thing only works to make it worse. We don't always correctly assign blame where it should, but doing this, it never helps anyone. This so ruined Saga's experience with fans that her online presence almost completely vanished beyond leaving a statement that she hadn't quit but had been fired. And the likely reason she never returned to the Xeno series ever past this was because of this bullshit, as she kept getting it from idiot Western fans wanting to flex their incel sexism for years afterwards. While Saga pops her head up every now and again for various reasons, the relationship the Xeno series architects had with fans of the series has never been the same since. Whatever was left to Takahashi and Saga's original plans was then sequestered into the Xenosaga side story Pied Piper, which takes place between episodes 2 and 3, and was made for mobile devices exclusively in Japan, as well as a paratextual web novel, Xenosaga: A Missing Year, that likewise fills in the missing span of time between episodes 2 and 3, while basically being an even greater lore dump about the backstory of the setting that actually does work to explain why things in this setting are the way they are, and why the villains of the game are doing what they seek to. The problem with that is, much like Xenogears, all of that information should have been in the story to begin with due to how essential it becomes to putting that story in proper context. And yet to this very day, it does not exist in any easily accessible form. Hell, Namco took down the missing year story when Xenosaga 3 released because it proved to have severe and significant continuity errors from what Xenosaga 3 actually ended up doing. So that big lore dump web novel ended up completely worthless. And speaking of the no import for you phenomena, an extended cut of Xenosagas 1 and 2, adding in additional scenes and story details and trying to fix Xenosaga 2's combat systems, was released for the Nintendo DS, exclusively in Japan. But none of these fixed what was broken, and only served to further turn off fans because the central story was becoming less and less self-contained without being a proper multimedia franchise that would present such side material to tell important events. And it was only going to get worse for reasons that should have been ironed out from the start of this project, but because, again, nothing seems to have been learned from Xenogears, was not. And key to that being, if you're going to tell a multi-game serialized narrative, not just a game that expands upon the existing story in sequel material, you need to plan it out and have the completed story, again, the completed story, and all its major bullet points set out in advance so they all occur in easily accessible material. And it shouldn't have been difficult to do, but by Xenosaga 2 literally throwing everything from the first game out, and just doing everything from scratch again, but worse because now they were fighting time crunch to get anything done, it shows they weren't actually building upon any foundation that had been established beforehand to try and refine it to make their job easier and focus on the truly essential material and assets. But hey, it's not like anyone has ever tried this multi-game serialized narrative thing before, right? Who would they even have as a comparable point to contrast their execution at all against? It's not like the PlayStation 2 had any other notable series divided into multiple.
Welcome to the world.
And yeah, anyone who knows me should have known where this was going. .hack Infection, Mutation, Outbreak, and Quarantine were a multi-game serialized narrative where after they completed each volume, one was capable of transferring one's save data into the next part of the series once each part of it released. The entire tetralogy uses the same game engine, same game mechanics, same graphical renders, and yet builds on it to do more and more with time without the base game having to be remade every single time. And as an active challenge to Monolift's preference for gigantic, explorable overworlds to the point they were the ones that probably brought them back with their worlds on Xenoblade and Legend of Zelda, the .hack game series signature is an area word system that uses procedurally generated programs to create literally tens of thousands of explorable zones. It is such a high number of areas that no .hack player has ever managed to visit every single one that can be generated through that system. Hell, CyberConnect even made it so that when they would later make a sequel game series that continued the story, except set 7 years later down the line, with a bunch of tie-in material events on the side happening between them, CyberConnect made sure that the game data from the first 4 games would again be transferable into the new games to unlock additional bonuses in the series' original PS2 release, even if nothing else major would come over itself. This, consequentially, is exactly the model Monolift should have followed, even with a new director and writer taking over, for the sole reason that retaining the gameplay systems of Xenosaga 1 would save them time and prevent a need to rebuild everything from the ground up again. It would free up resources to improve upon things that were janky in the first entry, as CyberConnect did between volumes. Maybe make battles faster, or permit more time to do more with the story, or craft additional stages to make it seem like something was actually happening. And moreover, if they had the entire story planned out and written in advance instead of having just broad strokes to the intended direction, there would have been far less egregious interferences by a new director and writer coming in to make a mess of what was going to happen. At best, they just revised what was there according to their vision, instead of having to just look through the cliff notes of what was skeletoned out to seem like they could do something with it. Though, to be fair,
To be fair.
To be fair.
to be absolutely fair in this compare-contrast, there is one major flaw in my argument, and that is the original iMac tetralogy for .hack was originally planned to be just one game. Just one. It was Bandai that suggested to CyberConnect to split up their single game into multiple separate ones and segment their storyline accordingly. This could have been just one game, and all 4 parts do run on the same engine, and by the 4th volume you're able to play every single stage and cutscene if you've gone through the trouble of unlocking them, meaning they needed to be in this game to begin with even if they're not playable. So that was feasibly doable on the PS2. However, my point stands for one single solitary reason. CyberConnect's creative staff and storyline writers had the entire story they wanted to tell planned out, and even sequestered the easily accessible multimedia material released alongside and before the relevant content it connected to in ways Monolift never properly attempted, through which CyberConnect allowed for better grasp and understanding of their grand, sweeping narrative. That doesn't mean every entry is good. I have eviscerated the Legend of Twilight anime and .hack roots for their writers actively working against everything else done in the franchise. And now .hack Link is a case study for mangled characterization and a storyline no one wanted and no one was on board with. But this is a minority of the overall content of that franchise that otherwise succeed in taking those partial to it through a story that is ultimately existential and character exploratory in its narrative in a way the Xeno series kept trying for and yet was struggling to pull off. Now, besides it being me, Shinta, the .hack retrospective guy who is obviously a huge fan of it, why is that game series actually relevant to this discussion? Well, as a reminder for those who don't know, .hack Infection and Xenosaga Episode 1 released within weeks of each other originally. They were both multi-game episodic narratives with their story split between those various volumes you would need to collect to obtain the full story. But while it was taking longer for the Xenosaga game series to release, in part because of that forced production reset, from the fact that we got 2 multimedia sequel storylines to the iMac era game series before it got canned, showed that Bandai got what it wanted back from the sales of CyberConnect's games, thus proving that multi-entry video game storylines can work, and should have been able to continue working with Xenosaga to continue supporting Monolift's multi-game storyline plan. It was, quite frankly, Monolift's own shot to screw up, with the exception to Bandai of America completely screwing up advertisement and distribution of said games to their consumer base. Which, unfortunately, as I have chronicled over the last 14 years, is their biggest point of failure in what I call the Bandai of America competence black hole. Bandai of Japan, great product promotion. Bandai Asia does that job across multiple nations successfully. But Bandai of America, their consistent fuck-up is, even if something gets popular and has fans, it is a complete crapshoot when it comes to telling people that these products are coming out, and actually distributing them to those who would be interested in buying them across the fucking board, as they're completely incapable of telling what people actually want. This meant that if you liked a more niche title or product line and would happily buy it, you'd regularly have trouble getting it back in the day or knowing new things for it existed, as they would not tell you, and they would not put it in the area you actually were in. And the final entries of each storyline as consequence, .hack Quarantine and Xenosaga Episode 3 respectively, are among the rarest and most expensive games to get for the PlayStation 2. Part of that comes down to it being a consequence of this horrible advertisement and distribution, so people who wanted them weren't able to easily get them. However, the reason why they are so rare differs between them. .hack Quarantine is rare in the West because .hack fans will not let go of them because there has been no re-release of the iMac games as there was in Japan. Yet, we have received some recent word that Bandai actually might be willing to do a remaster collection, but we have no idea if that's going to actually be followed through on. So, thus, .hack fans are unwilling to part with them if they can all help it. Thus, they're not in resale circulation without them going for far more than they originally did. An issue only made worse because they were multi-entry game series, where if you don't have the final volume, you don't have the complete story. And because Bandai of America would frequently foot the bill for Western distribution at all, it would consistently be a crapshoot on whether Europe would get Bandai, well, anything imported itself. But for Xenosaga, it was specifically made worse, because the only part of Xenosaga Europe got was Xenosaga 2. You know, the really bad one, the contender for worst in the franchise one. By the point they did so, however, how bad Xenosaga 2 was had gotten around. So European Xeno fans didn't buy it, wouldn't buy it without Episode 1 being distributed to their region first, or had imported the American release already before how bad it was got around, which skewed the sales demographic data entirely. Just like it is now, where smart people that like what Bandai releases then go buying their games off of PlayAsia now instead of Bandai America's horrible website, because Bandai of America's horrible website price gouges you on shipping. If you want physical copies, they no longer distribute to stores, which is only making their financial situation worse by them not doing so. Seriously, I can get international free shipping purchase through PlayAsia and have it delivered faster than I could anything from Bandai's website, even though they price gouge you into paying $20 for ground economy fucking shipping in an unpadded envelope. That's bad business, which is my point with Bandai of America. They're a bad division of a company that might make mistakes, but isn't a complete black hole of competence as their Western branch is. But Xenosaga 2 only proved to be a loss leader, leading to why, amidst everything else that was going wrong, Europe did not get what would prove to be the final part of this storyline. Xenosaga Episode 3 also Sprach Zarathustra, which ended up a near complete failure. While Xenosaga has its fans, especially now that the XenoBlade games revitalized interest in it, at the time of the game's original release, there were few fans at the time who got past the mangling that Xenosaga 2 gave the franchise. Its sale, consequentially, was a bit of a disaster, and not in ways that can be blamed on the Western divisions of Bandai screwing up their distributions, as the Western sales in all markets were only marginally lower than the Japanese side according to the sales records I was able to find. But between the staff changes, Xenosaga 2 only officially adding 5% of the story to make it so that 75% remained to get through, because Monolift Soft did not plan and write the story they wanted to tell in advance, and the horrible reception that came as a result as that 5% was effectively 0% and how worthless it was. Well, sales were bad before Bandai America could do anything to add to the damage. Which again, if you dive deeper into trends that Xenoverse article didn't touch, is itself baffling because they clearly were trying to support it. The copy of Xenosaga 1 I own, yeah, it's a red label PS2 game. The red label indicates that it was a game that got a greatest hits redistribution, meaning that it sold enough to become popular. Sales requirements varied for a title to qualify, and not every title that qualified got a greatest hits redistribution. Again, every Dot Hack game exceeded that sales requirement, and yet never saw that support due to Bandai America's fucking that up. But Xenosaga 1 clearly did. Hell, this version is easier to find than the base version is. Yet Xenosaga 2? Yeah, no, it didn't meet this. So just going into Xenosaga 3, sales were in freefall. Modelsoft needed to right this ship, fix everything that was going wrong, and turn everything around for their flagship IP. None of that ended up happening. The story was, in all effect, 20% done. And because of Xenosaga 2's disastrous sales, they weren't getting another 3 or 4 games to try and turn things around to tell the rest of the tale correctly. What was officially going to be 6 games that could be shrunk to 4 or 5 had now collapsed to just a total of 3, leaving just that final game in the trilogy to relate 80% of what was originally being set up. But shoving all of that in? That was never going to happen. So instead, out the window goes the plotlines for Momo, Ziggy, Junior, and Chaos. They have some finality and conclusion tacked on at the very end, but Cosmos was meant to be the central feature of these games, so her stuff had to stick, and consequently Cosmos being tied to Shion meant she also needed to remain a major character. But as I said, her agency and story had already been severely damaged by Jin's mere existence, so that was on rocky ground itself, which required her role as protagonist to be recentered in the narrative, which was done primarily through the Pied Piper game, that again, fans outside of Japan had zero access to. While the events of that game are summarized at the beginning of Xenosaga 3, as 3 starts after a substantial time skip, just like what happened with Xenogears, that plot summarization is not a replacement for the full experience. And no, that isn't hypocritical coming from a guy that did an internet review show that summarized the stories of games to critique them. We are not a replacement for the original material either. All we do is provide evidence through which to substantiate our critiques or create a venue to add context from other relevant materials. But hey, okay, refocus everything on solely Xion and Cosmos. Cut out the detours and diversions into existential crap. Get to the central most important points that are important to telling the story of this future society whose various faction leaders are trying to kill, usurp, or blind a god entity. Simple and direct, right? Yeah, no. What do you think they were going to do? Again, Takahashi's ambitions exceeded his reach as what he was trying to lay down just was not connecting, either with the production staff or the audience. For now, in comes the Xenosaga demo disc. Now, the demo disc was required. Monolift needed to gain back audience confidence in the series by showing they were fixing what Xenosaga 2 broke. They came in showing improved graphics, character renders, the original English voice cast was back for the export of it. More or less. And they had a combat system that allowed you to get the battles done fast. As in, the fastest they'd ever allowed players to get done with fights to get on to the next thing of interest in the franchise, game mechanics. And they did that by just making everything turn-based without any stupid gimmicks that drove players crazy, since Xenogears that dragged out gameplay unnecessarily into time-wasting exercises. It was, in effect, just Final Fantasy X's combat system. But Final Fantasy X's combat system is a leader for the best battle system Final Fantasy has ever done for turn-based combat. Or just combat in general. The demo just got people hyped back up for the game. At least until a single thing happened that ruined it for Monolith Soft. For you see, whoever coded the demo disc happened to put the script for the entire game story inside of it. So when a fan jailbroke that demo disc right after they got it, yeah, Xenosaga 3's entire story was instantaneously in the fandom's hands half a year before Xenosaga 3 would actually release. And they unequivocally hated it. Like, they hated it more than Xenosaga 2's story, and it barely had a story. So yes, to reiterate my earlier point, what happened with the Disney Star Wars sequel trilogy is not a unique sequence of events. It has happened before in other franchises, and it will happen again. And it's what happens when you set up a long-form multi-entry narrative structure, and then don't actually plan out the scripting and pacing of the story in any meaningful way or concurrently build upon what was done previously to advance that story through the legacy it presents. I don't care if you like parts of that trilogy. I don't mind if you are a fan of Star Wars Episode 8. The point of why it's repeatedly condemned is it is not cohesive between the three parts of it, nor is it copacetic with the universe set up before and around it, with everything else bending over backwards to accommodate it instead of writing and correcting its inconsistencies. That's not a good thing any time it has happened with a franchise. It is not unique in this, so stop getting up on a high horse about it. But if you want a different, slightly less controversial example, in video game terms, this makes Xenosaga the Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy equivalent for the Xeno franchise, more common comparison to its originator franchise. With the 13s being a series whose ambitions never escaped the fact that the stories were told poorly, and did wrong by their characters because everything important to telling those tales was in fact left out of them, and even with context to them, would regularly end up contradicting their own damn lore and character motivations. And thus for Xenosaga, the script found in the demo disc ended up the final nail for this sect of the franchise. So when the game did finally release, well, even disregarding Bandai of America's bullshit, it sold badly everywhere. Xenosaga 3 sold a third of what Xenosaga 1 did, and just above half of Xenosaga 2's numbers. And again, as I've been using .hack as a point of comparison on this, the .hack tetralogy and its sequel GU storyline did not see the same form of sales drop-off that the Xenosaga games did. There was still a slow decline entry over entry, but not such that they were selling half of what the previous one did, which is what Xenosaga suffered, which crippled Xenosaga's reputation irreparably. Hell, as I said, I originally picked up all of these games as I heard of their hype before I even started the show, and I got them all for crazy cheap in 2010 because former players just wanted to get rid of them, so they weren't being retained by fans, which made them rare. But they were in fact being disposed of, or didn't even have enough copies around when interest picked back up for the series after the XenoBlade games started to go around. Xenosaga 3, the most expensive one to get now, cost me $15 to buy in 2010. It costs $300 or more now to get it used. More than that if you want it new in sealed packaging. That should probably have been my tip-off to something being wrong. But from 2008 through 2012, almost all PS2 games were easy to find, as the console spent that long being phased out for the PlayStation 3, due to the PS3's reputation of its only purpose being to play Blu-rays, Ratchet & Clank, and PS2 games in HD if you had a backwards compatible one.
Oh my god.
Yeah, welcome to the club, pal.
Hell, I'm not sure if the sticker is legible, but, yeah, I still have the sale stickers on my copy of Xenosaga 1, and I got this for $5 at a half-price books in 2010. Again, there's a reason I go to half-price books for all sorts of used media, as it can get that cheap, and they often don't know if they have a hidden gem. But the only reason these games are rare now is simply due to the lack of any form of recollection or digital re-release for Xenosaga, entirely because it sold so badly to start with. Again, the PS2 only .hack games are expensive now because fans of the franchise do not part with these, especially the final entries. Whereas Xenosaga's games are rare because they stopped selling, and now few people who want them because the revived Xeno interest can get them. So that's probably going to make you ask, what did Xenosaga 3 do that pissed its entire audience off? Well, remember when I said earlier that Momo is a Realian, a type of artificial person designed to pull back from the afterlife the souls of the dead, with her intended as a new body for her maker's dead daughter? Yeah, that wasn't a one-off for this cast. Cosmos is intended to be the reincarnation of Mary Magdalene. Yes, Mary Magdalene, the biblical Virgin Mary, with her dragging her soul out of the afterlife into this new form in order to undo what she and the biblical Joshua, who is revealed to be the ancient version of our party member Chaos as well, after they used the Zohar in biblical times to wedge open a door to the afterlife, in doing so creating the system known in the games as the Undus Mundus network, which acts as both a gameplay mechanic for revisiting prior places and even spectate on events, and also as one of the required in-universe mechanics for faster-than-light travel. But because it has wedged the door to the afterlife open, the UMN is also responsible for the ongoing collapse of the universe because that doorway is allowing the intrusion of higher dimensional order imaginary space beings to subsume normal space, on top of the propagation of the Gnosis. Meaning the bioforming Gnosis exposure does is just a twisted form of adaptation to that higher order dimensional plane, even as it destroys everything about what and whom those affected by it were.
And like that, you've lost me.
If all you heard for the last minute was me speaking crazy, yeah, that's the response a lot of people had. Ergo, why this game is the most talked about despite the XenoBlade games having been received positively. But it gets worse. The reason Xion is suddenly sick in this game is because she is a direct descendant of the Maiden of Mary Magdalene, with her family line acting as a spiritual anchor for Mary Magdalene's spirit in the afterlife, which helps her keep the door open. The problem with that is, because the descendants are all acting as the anchor, over their lifetime, their souls are getting sucked out of them to join Mary in the afterlife, thus causing the women of the family to die younger than they should be. And when all the experiments with the Zohar started happening, it hyper-accelerated the process. Xion and Jin's mother having been increasingly ill throughout their entire lives before her death as consequence to those experiments, and Xion's growing illness throughout Xenosaga 3 a consequence of her proximity to what was supposed to be Mary's new vessel. Which, quite frankly, didn't make sense to me because, by the mechanics of what Xenosaga itself says, if Xion is the new anchor for Mary's soul, and Cosmos is intended to drag Mary's soul out of the afterlife to close the gate to imaginary space to undo the damage that has been done, then those two being in close proximity should prevent Xion's illness by Cosmos acting as a secondary rig, pulling back on Mary instead of her pulling up on Xion alone. It shouldn't be making it worse like it does. What should be making it worse by the game's internal reasoning is the fact the last experiment with the Zohars wedged the doors to the afterlife wide open instead of just a crack open. So the repeated exposure to imaginary space and its encroachment on real space should be making the pull on her soul worse to cause that condition. The only logic I can figure as to why it's not is potentially because Cosmos was an imperfect prototype version of that intended vessel for Mary, so isn't doing her proper job of acting as that second tether, with the perfected version being Cosmos' stupid, sexy, evil twin, Talos, made to do that job, with Talos spending the game infrequently hounding the group in order to destroy Cosmos to prevent the harm she's allegedly causing Xion. The problem with this is parts of Mary's soul have already come to reside in Cosmos, explaining some parts of her abilities. So Talos' creator, which turns out to be Xion's only mostly dead boyfriend, would only end up starting over from scratch in the plot to drag Mary out of the afterlife, and in doing so, saving Xion's life. And again, if Mary's soul is already partially in Cosmos, then the drag on Xion to death should be less than it suddenly is, not suddenly more, or existing to begin with. So it's entirely at cross purposes when one thinks about it. And that's the majority of the game. The narrative is in conflict with the lore of the story it wants to tell, the events of the narrative is reliant on, and the characterization of those involved. Case in point, by the events of Xenosaga 3, somehow someone's found a way to tame the Gnosis, as presented in a combat trial for a new super weapon, but by that very scene, shouldn't that mean that the threat of the Gnosis is over and they don't need those very weapons? Yeah, that's not explained, and ends up later contradicted when we see cutscenes of entire planets being bioformed all at once. Made even worse is throughout the game, you can get special items that prevent the party members themselves from undergoing a Gnosis transformation from how exposed a lot of them have been, even though 2 of the party members are gynoids and another can literally exercise Gnosis with a touch. But if that drug exists to prevent the transformation, is there a reason why it's not widely available? Beyond, capitalism? Xion's introduced piloting the mecha that was supposed to be Cosmos' expanded personal support unit. In fact, it's first seen in Xenosaga 2, when Cosmos literally summons it to her from across space because they are intrinsically linked and won't work without her. And yet in Xenosaga 3 it suddenly does. By this point in the storyline, Xion's left her job at Vector Industries, but she can just take the mech while Cosmos is left to be decommissioned? Hell, we find Cosmos in a scrapyard. Shouldn't there have been more to that for Xion's only mostly dead boyfriend's plot to make it so Cosmos isn't killing her, than to toss her deactivated frame amongst some discarded mecha parts? Like, if she's actually the cause, you'd think he'd want to do everything to remove her in the entirety from her possibly harming Xion. And that's just the first act of the game. The second act, in fact, takes us back, in time, to the planet Miltia. Miltia was one of the sites of the government's experiments with the Zohar, and the one that was devastated the last time they messed with it. And in Xenosaga 2, it is transformed by the antagonist of solely Xenosaga 2 into a planetary weapon, which is subsequently destroyed by the cast in one of the most forgettable cases of a literal planetary superweapon ever. But, you remember what I said about Xenosaga retconning their own lore? Yeah, Miltia is the one they kept doing it to. But the frustrating thing is they keep redoing that same retcon. In Xenosaga 1, the fall of the planet is blamed on Momo's creator, only for the events of the game to reveal he was scapegoated for it and the contact experiments were what devastated the planet. In Xenosaga 2, they do that same thing over again, this time even making sections of the planet both before and after it was wrecked playable, but all they do is further expand on this plot point that's been over and done with already. And then Xenosaga 3 happens, and they do the exact same damn thing that we already did twice before in these games, all over again. Only this time making it into a flashback arc, where the current characters are forced to watch the entire sequence of events play out in full, without any capacity to change them despite their foreknowledge. Or rather, Jin's foreknowledge, because as said before, he knows everything about everything they see happen already, thanks to reports he got from the Yuzuki's parents and his own presence and experience within these events that no other has context to. In fact, throughout the entire arc of the game, Jin is deliberately trying to keep what he knows hidden, despite those details being key to a lot of them escaping this entire replay of events. Because in truth, the world they are experiencing this rerun of time on? Yeah, it's not Miltia. Not actually the events, but it's in fact a gigantic simulation recreated through the power of the Zohars and the Undus Mundus network. And this entire arc of the game is completely pointless time-wasting filler, as we already know nearly everything important that happens there from the previous 2 games. And you spend 60% of Xenosaga 3 here, in something that is still effectively worthless in progressing the story, just like was the problem of Xenosaga 2. Though we do get a couple new things out of this unnecessary repeat. One of which is the origin of Shion's relationship with her only mostly dead boyfriend, Kevin Winnicott, who during the Milsha incident was a teenage genius researcher into the Zohar and its effects on Shion's mother while Shion was a young child. And even then was designing the archetype of Cosmos to do the job of exorcising Mary from the afterlife to shut the Zohar down. Though, considering it's confirmed by this game that Kevin and Shion were sexually active multiple years before his death, Kevin died 2 years before Xenosaga 1's events begin at an accident tied to Cosmos' prototype combat tests, and Shion started Xenosaga 2 at age 22. Yeah, adult-ass man having sex with what Japanese considers as a minor. And yes, Japanese law makes exceptions for sex between those in a committed relationship who may have had such an age gap, but it's not a good look on the outside. But, hey, we're mulliganing that because Kevin's actually the only damn person who seems to care enough about Shion and what she's suffering for no damn reason, and Kevin is cooperating with the villains of the game for the sole purpose of shaving Shion's life. We can't exactly say that about her brother. The other thing of relevance for this incident in fact proves to be one contradicted by later story material. That being the premise that instead of it being the government's contact experiments being various attempts to kill Udu, the higher order life form that observes the universe through the Zohar in a scheme to take its power, which again is simultaneously happening during these events with Junior, it is revealed that Shion herself, due to her Maiden of Mary bloodline connection, is the one who called down the Gnosis from imaginary space to make her responsible for the calamity that is consuming the universe, a consequence of the Realian drones across Milsha going rampant amidst the Zohar contact experiments to start killing the populace, and Shion witnessing her mother's murder by them, which had become a suppressed memory on her behalf. The problem with this assertion is the fall of Milsha is not canonically the first appearance of the Gnosis and humanity's problem with dealing with them. Those in fact originate from the second set of contact experiments that took place on the planet Mictum years and years before the Milsha experiments, as proven and showcased in the final act of Xenosaga 3, which occurs on Mictum, where the cast even bring up that Gnosis attacks on the planet date back to that earlier experiment, as they find evidence of such occurring and why the planet was abandoned after its initial settlement. And before Milsha, the future government was already having issues with Gnosis as well, as proven by lore documents one could find throughout the games. It just wasn't widely known. So the game now trying to put all the blame for a crisis on a scared, traumatized girl in the midst of a planet-wide calamity, one that by the storyline's complete degeneration has been turned into an irresponsible adult with no control over her own impulses and emotions that is a key component in the character's complete loss of agency, while at the same time other things were using the Zohar and attacking the entity that lives in imaginary space at the same time to be more logically responsible? Yeah, this is where I just became completely done with the story due to how reprehensible it was being with this scapegoating. I haven't bothered to engage much with the cult of Xenosaga, and the Xenoverse article itself tries to avoid discussion of the unavoidable narrative issues Episode 3 brings into focus. But considering Shion was pretty much tied with Cosmos as the most popular Xenosaga character before this point, I can't imagine that was taken well, and by sales information probably was the breaking point for a lot of people. So, by the time you're done with the entire Milsha diversion, the game's already 85% done because you literally spent that long here doing absolutely nothing of worth. If anything, this made Jin come off as an even worse character because he could have told everyone everything of what he knew beforehand and skipped all of this beyond some cutscenes. There was no reason for him to have withheld what he knew. Now, this section of the game I have seen some comparisons made to Xenoblade Chronicle 2's expansion story, Torna the Golden Country. An expansion is correct, as Torna is about 30-ish hours in length, with that likewise showing how cyclical the Xeno series has been. And, no, it's not quite comparable, or at least not the way people are thinking. Xenogears and Xenosaga both have the problem that their narratives get too trapped in the past and the requirement for the audience to know about the past of these settings in implicit detail in order to understand what is happening in the present. XenoBlade 2 does not suffer from this problem. It doesn't get stuck dwelling on the past, and instead has its focus upon dealing with the consequences of what happened and its ongoing effects that caused the modern crisis the president of the setting is placed in. You're told what you need to know of those past events, only so much in the terms of how it is affecting the current state of the world and the machinations of the various antagonist factions of Xenoblade 2 to inform their goals and motivations. The Torna expansion is instead focused around the character stories of those it focuses on in the lead up to the events of the calamity, and how they who were involved in it ultimately failed to prevent it. You do not need to know it to appreciate the entirety of Xenoblade 2's storyline. Instead, the merit is in seeing the characters and how they were before everything went to hell, to then contrast and inform why those involved there are the way they are in present day. It is their character's origin story, as opposed to being a playable section of lore that has already been dumped upon us, as is the Xenogears and Saga issue. Sure, some of that is set up in main story, but not in a way that it keeps repeating already retread ground. Hell, there's a major character in Xenoblade 2 that has amnesia that one of the main characters is disturbed by because it's different than what happens to others of their kind, and for major plot reasons. The Torna DLC allows us to see her as she should have been before her entire being was violated, and allows that in earlier material to hit harder because we then know who she was before that was done to her, so the contrast between the two in the main story becomes all the more disturbing in the way she has been violated. This same thing is in play with everyone the Torna expansion brings up, and is thus made to matter in the way the prior games with their redundant repetition did not successfully achieve. The Xenoblade 3 Future Redeemed expansion did the same thing. It's set before the events of the main game, but fill in details that had deliberately been left unspecified beyond this was a period of our history, so it does not retread older ground and in fact provides context clarification for some of the more janky elements of Xenoblade 3's story, including the better explanation of Xenoblade 3's setting being one grand computer simulation that occurs within the span of a single second of time from the perspective of those that exist outside of the simulation, with the system that is running the simulation being what created the big bad of the game, amidst its attempts to unify the settings of Xenoblade 1 and 2 to prevent an even bigger calamity between the two worlds suddenly existing in the same dimensional layer at the same time after centuries of them being forcefully separated. Because in the Xeno series, the Zohar is a device powerful enough to take planets out of phase with normal space, clone entire worlds, or split them across completely different dimensional coordinates. So, reunification of them once those divergent dimensional phases start to collapse is a whole entire thing that in fact sets up Xenoblade 3's entire story. And because of the entire Milsha flashback arc of Xenosaga 3, it is demonstrably provable that simulations on that scale, which suck people into playing them out, is not an unknown in this franchise. Especially because it so very much explains everything about the Endless Now for it to be a simulation carried out to occupy people's digitized attention, while its main system meant to reconstruct the realities is experiencing a divide by zero error in its calculation. But again, I am getting ahead of myself. Both of these expansions in premise are similar to the playable Milsha flashback arc, the difference again coming down to the nature of their repetition and agency. In Xenosaga 3, the cast are just watching history play out from an outsider's perspective, even for those that were actually there, which compared to everything else we've already been told, comes off as a massive collection of retcons and not a natural plot reveal. In Xenoblade 2, while we know what the eventual result of Torna's events are, the character stories and the agency granted them throughout its tale, including the stories of brand new characters never introduced before this and how those relationships helped define those characters, allow it to have strength and value to it and more emphasize how reprehensible things done to them are that leads them to their eventual actions in the main story and how they have actively changed. And the Future Redeemed story, because the lack of allusion or context to it, just slots in perfectly with everything else we came to learn of the setting and the world built out of this simulation. Hell, Xenogears handled this better than Xenosaga 3 did with its flashbacks because they are built into the story. It doesn't feel that way with Xenosaga 3, thanks to how they kept tacking on new thing after new thing upon the exact same set of events that had been explored in alternate context already. There reaches a point when you tell the audience the information you've given them is entirely wrong, and it's actually this other thing entirely divorced from that which was said before, that the audience will become exhausted of the unnecessary editorial changes and just disengage. Xenoblade 2 and 3 had their versions of this be cohesive. Xenosaga 3's ended up corrupted specifically due to the narrative repetition that was just so utterly damaging to the cast. Especially because, again, they had to get so much of the storyline done in just this single entry, and they were just wasting all that time with yet another flashback arc to this area. So, moving on, after these revelations, we have to go stop the head of the future government, Dmitri, from using the Zohar to gain ultimate power. And I barely remember this. This is the guy behind the Kill God side of the plot, and in fact has had sleeper agents among the supporting cast members, and after everything else that's happened, he's barely an afterthought. Mainly because of what happens after we kill this guy. But this is kind of relevant to my reviews from last year. In 2024, I spent just short of 13 hours eviscerating Code Geass for being a series that had a fantastic start, but screwed itself up in chasing an ending to its original series that, due to various factors, just did not work. Thanks to the thematic villain of the narrative winning by the end in subjugating the world to his will by stealing the identity of the series' true hero. Or at least that of the hero's dual identity, while encouraging the hero to destroy himself and defame his name. An event fans of the franchise have wanted undone or corrected since it originally aired. And Sunrise's refusal to understand this in all subsequent media has by this point irreparably broken the franchise because the real villain's irresponsibility keeps being the root cause of the ongoing calamities set after this original ending. But again, I already spent 13 hours on that, and I'm not over here to quite retread all of that. Go and watch the videos and all the series I recommend over Code Geass that I bring up in that review. But I mentioned it more to bring up here what I did there, and that I am almost dead certain that Xenosaga 3 in big and small ways was an influence in Code Geass' supernatural mythos arc. For those who don't know, Code Geass' head writer Ichiro Gucci did not plan out anything about the lore for Codes and Code Geass, despite those being the literal titular superpowers. Hell, Cece herself was a late edition character not originally planned to be part of the series. She was merely introduced as a story device to give Code Geass' protagonist, Lelouch, his magic eye power and is worthless to the larger tale. Primarily because the series was not originally planned out to have magic eye powers or the immortality powers or anything supernatural at all. The story was really meant to focus on the contrasting dynamics of actual main characters Lelouch, Callan, and Suzaku. Lelouch and Callan rebelling in the name of freedom and to tear down corrupt systems the world is being enslaved by, while Suzaku serves and promotes a fascist system and monarchy that is pro-slavery and oppression, because it gives him special privileges at the cost of denying those opportunities to everyone else. Again, I go over that more in-depth in the 13-hour review. That is not what is relevant to bring up here. What is important to this is instead how Okuchi tried to end the supernatural mythos plot. Because after Sunrise insisted they needed some form of supernatural element to their political thriller mecha anime, of course they need to actually make sure it had some form of payoff, despite how much it more and more became to be the absolute worst element of Code Geass. Yes, the powers that are the title of the franchise are among its most despised elements. Again, Sunrise executives who mandated that the power exist in the series are not known for being smart. Bandai has to overrule them a lot for good given reasons. But that leads to the revelations about the Ragnarok Connection. That the main big bad of the series, Charles Z. Britannia, Lelouch's father, is planning to use the power of Codes and Geass alongside ancient relics called Thought Elevators, and a special device he and his cult of Geass users have fashioned called the Sword of Akasha, with intent to kill and usurp the power of God, which lives in a higher order dimension that also claims to house the collective unconsciousness of humanity and their afterlife, to reshape the world to his own will. And everything about the nation he rules and the self-destructing shape of the world has been twisted to achieving that end. This is, in essence, the same as the climax of Xenosaga 3, only done debatably worse. Code Geass' developmental timeline for when Okuchi was writing the scripts lines up directly with Xenosaga 3's release in Japan, and Okuchi himself is an admitted fan of the Xeno series. So it really would surprise no one to find out he filed off the serial numbers to what Xenosaga was doing for its climax, and just threw into it the writing of his series to conclude this plot he didn't want to focus on to begin with. The original draft of which even requiring a child with a connection to what they were trying to activate to trigger the device that would give the antagonists their goals, as explored in some of Code Geass' spin-off media. It comes off as that direct a ripoff because Okuchi was too focused on achieving the ending to the series that had been planned since before the first episode had been written. An ending that now, as already said, has come to be widely loathed and have connotations to it that likely were not considered at the time of its crafting. Again, I go over that in more depth in the review, but yes, the ending of Code Geass R2 is why the entirety of Code Geass R2 is terrible. But wait, you might say. Xenosaga didn't seem to be doing that cosmic reset thing that Code Geass was doing as part of its plot, so it can't possibly be the same as a result. I wasn't done. We haven't even gotten to Zarathustra yet. But, yeah, Zarathustra, the final super tech device of the series, is quite literally a cosmic reset button that requires the Zohar to power it. Which brings us to the other main antagonists of the Xenosaga series that are not the government, the cult of Ormus. Ormus, for the last 6,000 years of the setting, has been trying to reclaim the Zohar and prevent humanity from fucking with it. Because every time humanity messes with the Zohar, they poke the bear that is Udu, and instantaneously make things worse for everyone. The reason why humanity is out in space is the earliest contact experiments literally destroyed Earth and required everyone to evacuate the planet to not die. In reality, Earth was consumed by imaginary space and displaced in its place in reality, resettled without anyone realizing what planet it is, as the planet Mictum, where ironically the second Zohar contact experiments took place to devastate the planet before the Miltia incident.
Oh my god, I was wrong. It was Earth all along.
And now, where the Zohar has been returned after the fall of Dimitri, when Ormus then takes the Zohar back to make things go full circle. Ormus is also the front for the game's fellow antagonist, the mysterious immortal Wilhelm, who is also the head of the organization Xion worked for at Vector Industries, the one who recruited Kevin to create Cosmos and Telos to pull Mary out of imaginary space, has revived a bunch of antagonists of the storyline to act as his Testament minions serving his whims, and yes, a Testament is the name of these revived antagonist characters. One of them, in this final endgame, Boss Rush, revealed to be the one who murdered Ziggy's family and led to him turning himself into a cyborg. And Wilhelm's whole big, evil, bad scheme is to undo the damage that has been done to the universe by people fucking with the Zohar, because we are given legitimized circumstances by which to actually hit the cosmic reset button, as everything is going to die if they don't. I did say he was the villain, right? Because this is one of those games that, based on solely information provided in just the game, I am finding that I am fully siding with the villains. Even if it gives Wilhelm immortality as consequence, even though Wilhelm is already presented inside the game as being immortal, so he doesn't exactly get anything out of it. Now this is why Kevin is still working for him, as doing this is going to save Xion's life!
I want to save you, Xion. With this power, I can free you from the terror of death.
Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention. Kevin is voiced by Yuri Lowenthal in English, with Yuri this same year beginning to voice his role of Ryo Haseo Misaki in the Dot Hack franchise, which makes this specific line absolutely hilarious in retrospect. Again, there is a reason I keep bringing this up, as I can use the character of Haseo as a compliment and counterpoint to literally every other role Yuri has ever performed.
The rebirth. The power of hope.
The final wave. The surge of rebirth. Using the terror of death as a key to trigger the resurrection? Was that your plan all along, Huvan?
The rebirth is a safety device. A failsafe, really. Left behind by the creator of the world. A reinitialization program. However, only the fully awakened terror of death is capable of activating it.
Me?
This is a gamble. But I believe it's something worth betting on.
Even if you're putting everything you are on the line?
Yes.
That's it? You finally come clean and now you think everything has been straightened out? This close to the end? When things have gotten this bad? Tell me, how many people do you think you've hurt since this started? How many have grieved? How many have suffered? You stepped on so many people just so that you can achieve your self-serving dream! No one has that right! Everybody grieves! Everybody suffers! Everybody has truths they want to ignore! You are not special! You're just like everyone else!
Hell, even Xion decides briefly to side with them. And unlike the game, I can't actually blame her because when you put Jin's actions in context to the revelations they had just dumped on them, where he hid her life-threatening illness from her, and the game blaming her unjustly for the current Gnosis and universe collapse crisis, of course she's going to be tempted to help those that seem to have a solution to all of this, which her team has all but given up on doing. And spoilers, they don't fix it. At the end of Xenosaga, the universe is still collapsing. They just bought more time because what Kevin and Wilhelm were trying to do and shut down the Zohar actually fucking worked! But instead, the game treats this as some form of big betrayal by a flippant, flighty, irresponsible girl and just... fuck this game by this point in it ripping up every aspect of Xion's agency. I was already done with this plot before this point, but after this I was just ready for it to end so I could throw my copies in the trash. I did actually, considering how much they cost these days. Due to how badly they come to treat her and how characters act in response to her. We want you to have some resolve and make a choice, but don't make that choice. I want you to come to a decision, but don't make a decision we disagree with because we know things we didn't tell you. Again, fuck this game. Fuck where this has gone, where they're deliberately making Kevin be a villain when all of Xion's allies keep telling her, no, don't go to Kevin, when this entire time he's been honest about his goals, actions, and motivations, while making Xion come off as an irresponsible invalid, and saying her friends are the good guys in this when they're not. And just treating Kevin's existence as a testament as all the evidence they need of his ill intent, despite Kevin doing everything they won't to save her, when these people know this universe is already doomed. And they found no other way to resolve any of this. And yet they all come off as spiteful towards him, considering the idea without internal justifications. All they have here are straw arguments, not validated, but would be actually been showcased to take place. Jin makes more sense as the real villain of this story by this point due to his actions. That would have made more sense. That is how badly the storyline has become mangled by his inclusion and involvement.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
And yes, I just used that clip with sincerity. This is how bad the writing got by this point. It is an example of just how much the game missed the mark with everything, and likely as a consequence of the writing of Xion, Jin, and the way these revelations are formatted to make the villain seem like a better, more reasonable person than your party members. So, yeah, back to Zarathustra. And here's what the game does not tell you at any point inside the game itself, but it was only revealed to be true in supplementary material after the fact for Japanese-only audiences. Wilhelm has already used Zarathustra before, innumerable times, and even he is unaware of this fact, because as said, the device is a cosmic reset button. It undoes the damage the Zohar is causing by turning the universe off and on again, making it begin again from the start, with the device itself acting as a time capsule for all of humanity's souls, so they can be reborn in the reset universe. The entire universe is consequentially trapped in a causal loop where the universe is reset, humanity discovers the Zohar, they mess with it, Wilhelm and his organization tries to stop them from messing with it, they fail, and the universe keeps getting consumed by imaginary space. Or if one wants a simpler explanation for what is occurring, I direct you all to the climax of the series JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 6 Stone Ocean, as it's basically the same thing, and would not surprise me if this version of the explanation for why Wilhelm's plan technically wouldn't work actually came from someone telling the staff what they put in made no sense, and decided to just use something in pop culture media approximation to later patch over this pretty significant narrative deficiency. As again, without the knowledge that prior versions of Wilhelm have already tried this plan only to end up back here again and again, it makes the characters we've been following all this time more and more come off as the bad guys for stopping the only viable solution to prevent the entire universe from collapsing. Especially because in these events, we first get an explanation to what chaos is, and apparently he's a living incarnation of the concept of entropy, his power to destroy Gnosis being a direct consequence and contributing cause to the universe's pending collapse. I don't know why this is suddenly a thing, but again, so much of the storyline was left on the cutting room floor to just wrap up what they could, that it doesn't surprise me their validating evidence for this sudden claim is non-existent. Hell, this wouldn't have done wonders for explaining the Gnosis problem better than blaming Xion. Yet the solution seems to just spread more blame on the party for making things worse. And for the track record, that's Junior for his part in attacking Udo, Chaos for existing as an avatar of entropy, Momo for being an archetype for the reality and system meant to drag human souls out of the afterlife, Cosmos for being Mary Magdalene, or at least a host for her soul that becomes her, who wedged open the door to imaginary space, making it so the Zohar can't leave, and the Gnosis won't stop coming through the cracks she wedged open to cause this calamity in the first place, and Jin for keeping everything that he used secret from everyone else, so there was no way to resolve this any way faster, and with less damage to everything else going on. With the exception to Ziggy, who stopped being a character in the narrative, everyone else is more responsible for all of this in this party than Shion, and none of them want to take responsibility for their own roles in it. But the reason this plan with Zarathustra keeps failing and the Zohar keeps its focus on this universe is because its observers are still present in it and have been incarnating into various members of humanity. For those who didn't watch the Xenogears reviews, the boy is Abel, the original incarnation of Xenogears protagonist Faye, who made contact with Udu through the Zohar in Xenogears' ancient past, and thus became the way it experienced life in this realm by proxy. The girl next to Abel is Nephilim, this universe's incarnation of Ellie, also from Xenogears. Nephilim is also the maiden of Mary Magdalene and what has been spectating down Shion's matriarchal family line. So Mary tethering her soul to this observer, who is not harmful to the universe on her own, to keep the connection to the Zohar active, has once been causing all of these problems. Wilhelm, in this incarnation at least, actually seemed to have figured this out and the need to get these souls out of his crucible for this latest reset to work when the others didn't. Meaning, even with this info from supplementary material factored in about the universe-wide time loop, thematically Wilhelm is still in the right even if his methods are questionable at best, and our protagonists are screwing everything over, preventing the damage from being undone.
Does that sound like a hero?
Well, when you put it like that, not really, but,
Then what the hell, man? What the actual hell?
Also different is, by this time, Cosmos has defeated Telos and fused with her to succeed in dragging Mary's soul out of the afterlife. So the Zohar actually can be shut down properly now, that, on its own, would stop the universal collapse. So one might argue, well, Wilhelm's a villain still because he doesn't want to stop his scheme even with the collapse's cause resolved. As resetting the universe would still require he kill everyone left. Except the only reason he got that was again the steps that Wilhelm needed to get this far and address the causes of the collapse, which the others weren't. And just shutting the gate doesn't deal with the Gnosis still around, as despite the game treating them as not an issue, the game itself at this point shows that the Gnosis haven't been going anywhere and were still present even with the gates closed. So the universal collapse was still ongoing even with the Zohar capable of being shut down. His reset would still fix that and give humanity a proper chance to live and grow outwards without this Damocles sword repeatedly coming to hang over their heads. I can empathize with that, because among everything else, that desire to fix something fully and properly is the most human one can be. His apathy born more out of long-standing frustration with everyone that makes this step required to start over. It's not that he can't see other options, but nothing that won't leave things irreparably broken when start over should address the cause more permanently. And I don't see that from the heroes because of Jin and how the game has treated Shion. But unfortunately, we're on the rails for the storyline that won't acknowledge that. So Wilhelm is killed, Zarathustra is destroyed, and Chaos, Cosmos, and Jin draw the Gnosis from across the universe into the Zohar with the assistance of Udu's observers, throwing the ghosts and those converted into such back into imaginary space and out of real space, and taking Mictum, aka Earth, with it, and returning it to its original place in the universe. But with the damage still done there, but the spacefaring humanity not having the capacity to rebuild, as due to how their FTL tech worked, shutting down the Zohar made such tech inoperable. With the game ending on the premise that to fix the rest of the universe, they just have to find Earth again, and the body of Cosmos that is floating in space over it.
And even if everything is already predetermined, it's not something for us to be sad about. No, on the contrary, the future is overflowing with hope, and we have infinite paths to choose from.
That is a self-contradictory statement. When something is predetermined, there are no other possibilities for something to occur. That is why predetermination exists. If infinite possibilities are, well, possible, then you can't determine something before it happens outside of using prior knowledge and experiences to make educated judgments. If you have a precognitive view of something, as happens in XenoBlade 1, then you can use that information to change what occurs if you know what the initial steps are. It gives you new information to obtain a new possibility, but if predetermination is in play, then that knowledge is entirely worthless, so you can't get another possibility. Yes. But yeah, that's how Xenosaga ended. But, is it really how it ended? Yeah, this is where it ended. This game historically was a disaster, and left Monolith Soft in a bad shape. Company morale was in the toilet by late 2006. And with Masaya Nakamura leaving Namco just before Namco entered talks to merge with Namco Bandai, well, after the merger, Monolith Soft did not have an advocate at Bandai to speak in favor of their original productions. And because of Xenosaga's outright failure and losses for the company, they weren't being given the opportunities for more than outsourced work for other IPs not their own at the time. And that isn't an unknown. Again, to bring CyberConnect into this discussion, I've had chances to talk to some of that company's developers. And while they keep making fighting games for Bandai with the likes of Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, the Naruto Ninja Storm series, Demon Slayer Kimetsu no Yaiba's game, and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, they only do those to keep the lights on and the employees fed at the company. And they're sick of that because when they have been publishing their own IPs, they don't sell well enough because they're not a mainstream pre-established intellectual property. And yet, we've been getting multiple games in the Fuga Melodies of Steel series that expand on CyberConnect's existing Little Tail Bronx narrative, which I have discussed in the past. And they have been very highly rated games. It's just because they're not mainstream, they don't see the sales they need. It might not be more .hack like fans of that franchise, including myself, want, but I supported those original IPs because it's clear that's where their true passions and creativity lie to make them so good. And that's not to say Bandai gave Monolith Soft no support ever. They did help Monolith Soft produce an anime adaptation of Xenosaga 1 that ran for 12 episodes. But that series didn't do well either, despite it trying to bridge the narrative inconsistencies between the first two games, even foreshadowing some of the things that would occur in Xenosaga 3. Toei was responsible for animating it, but because of how dense the games were, well, 12 episodes just wasn't enough to hit everything important in a decompressed enough form for those unfamiliar with the games to get on board it. And mind you, Monolith Soft did not originally intend to make an anime adaptation of Xenosaga 1. That was Bandai's idea to help them promote the IP in order for it to do better and reach more people. Only for Monolith Soft to be the one that fumbled that ball themselves with Xenosagas 2 and 3. But nothing in Monolith Soft's flagship IP was panning out. Anything Bandai invested in them was not doing well for anyone involved. I know people like to demonize Bandai a lot because of how monolithic they can be as a business entity, not helped by Yoshiyuki Tomino regularly slandering the company for things that Sunrise executives themselves would do, and once more the incompetence of their American division. But when you give someone money for their creative pursuits and one doesn't see a return on that investment, any logical person is going to be more hesitant to do so the more that keeps happening. Bandai's portfolio is very diverse between anime, live-action series, games of both the tabletop and digital variety, and of course, their toys and model kits. But Bandai is not Disney. They do not make Disney money, and the mid-2000s were a pretty bad time to be Bandai because of how deeply their American division was causing them to hemorrhage money with their myriad of screw-ups. So with Monolith Soft having that same experience earlier, they just need to ride out the period of distrust to actually get on better footing. And it's not like the Xeno series is the only thing Monolith Soft has ever done. They're also responsible for the Bates and Kaito's duology, which were pretty well received. They did the Nintendo DS game Soma Bringer, which was Soraya Saga's actual last writing credit to date before the harassment over Xenosaga just made her quit creative pursuits entirely. They did Dragon Ball Z Attack of the Saiyans, a rather forgettable Nintendo DS adaptation of that series. They helped on Dirge of Cerberus, the worst chapter of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII project from Square-Enix. Though that one was doomed to failure from the outset, so it's hard to blame what went wrong with it on them. That's one of Yoshinori Katase's many failures with that franchise, and I will hear no other word on the subject matter. They did their own contributions to Bandai's Super Robot Wars games with the OG Saga Endless Frontier games, a duology of titles for the Nintendo DS, which even had Cosmos cameo in them as part of Cosmos' beginning to travel the multiverse through a few varied productions. And they are the central developers to the cross-game trilogy of Namco Cross Capcom and Project Cross Zones 1 and 2, which I greatly enjoyed and has a running longer narrative across all three titles that, sadly, is not apparent to many because Namco Cross Capcom never saw American imports, likely as a consequence of either the Bandai merger or the aforementioned Bandai of America competence black hole when it comes to game imports and failure to advertise their products correctly. Or even potentially conflicts with Capcom in the rights distribution, as mid-2000s Capcom was doing all sorts of stupid things with their IPs that would spend years biting them in the ass. And yeah, just a bit of a secret I kept to myself for years. Because so very many of the series I like have crossover appeal, one of the goals of my show, something I've been wanting to do for years, was actually be one of the few people to play and review every game that would have gone into the production of the Project Crosszone games. Even started the Xeno Series review specifically as the next chapter in achieving that goal due to Cosmos appearing in the Endless Frontier games, and the Endless Frontier games as well as Namco Cross Capcom, leading into the Project Crosszone duology. Unfortunately, due to my retirement from doing reviews for the sake of my own health and mental well-being, that's become a pipe dream. But if you look back across everything I've done for years and years and years, that was all directed at that ultimate end goal of everything I had intended to do ever since the end of the second year of my show. It's just a shame I never saw the support needed to make that a viable finale. Alongside everything else I just had to stop doing to not become someone I hate being. So yeah, they were doing other things. But there's a running problem with all these titles. They weren't promoted well. At all. I got into Super Robot Wars games in the late 2000s because of YouTube clips of the games. And yet I had no idea until I was filming my review of Super Robot Wars V that OG Saga Endless Frontier had an official import, and it cost me a few days overtime pay to afford a copy. The only reason I knew of the Project Crosszone games was because they had .hack characters in them, and I heard of the games through that social media grapevine to pick them up. But the involved companies didn't promote them at all, so despite them being big IP crossover games that should sell well or work to promote all these other fun properties someone can get enjoyment out of and then want to seek out, they were completely passed by. This kept happening with Monolith Soft's games for years. So all of these all end up better efforts, with better writing than what Xenosaga itself had by its end. The consumer faith in the company was in the toilet. Takahashi's arrogance in not learning the lessons from Xenogears' shortcomings, alongside Sugiura's well-intentioned sidelining of Takahashi from a direct creative role in favor of the less experienced and competent, were putting the company at very real risk of collapse. At least until one other group entered the picture.
I'm really feeling it!
Sorry, Rex. I couldn't tell you. Because... I got an invitation to join Smash!
Yes, in 2007, this is where Nintendo finally enters the picture. Namco Bandai were looking to sell their stake in Monolith Soft as a consequence of the risk they took on Xenosaga not panning out. But a consultation from Shinji Hatano, an executive director at Nintendo at the time, who saw how Monolith Soft kept trying to do different things than expected of the industry, even if they were fumbling at it and other companies were also doing those things with better executions, well, he saw potential in Takahashi and his cohorts and wanted to give them the chances Bandai just wasn't anymore. Nintendo purchased a majority stake in Monolith Soft, with Bandai still retaining some of its shares in the company so as to ensure the games they had farmed out to them would be completed. While in turn, Nintendo giving Monolith Soft the support to continue developing their own IP work in exchange for them becoming a subsidiary developer for them and help them out in the make of their own games over time. We got the Subspace Emissary campaign of Brawl because of this. We got many Legend of Zelda games because of this, starting with Skyward Sword, but was essentially with Breath of the Wild and its gigantic map. And both Animal Crossing and Splatoon exist because of their help in development. And because of these projects and Nintendo's support, well, Takahashi got that third chance to tell the Xeno Series story by reimagining it once again. As the story goes about this, one day Takahashi got this idea in his head that would absolutely not leave. Of two giants, one biological and one mechanical, interlocked in an unending conflict, their frozen movements causing the races that would develop upon their bodies to instead continue the battle that began with them, and members of those peoples traversing their bodies to bring it to an end. This he mapped out in a surprisingly short amount of time, not long after the Nintendo takeover, brought it to Sugiura and the Nintendo representatives, and got this new project greenlit, which he would creatively oversee directly. No stepping back to only advise this time, as had been what mangled Xenosaga. He would stay involved this time, But his wife is a writer again? Yeah, again, she was out. Just done with the franchise because of the harassment from the cult of Xeno. Those who took over for them, not willing to return to those roles. But there did seem to be someone Takahashi could contact who was familiar with the Xeno series, thanks to their work on it that could pan out as a new writer that Takahashi could collaborate with. Someone who was very experienced in narrative structuring in the ways Takahashi needed, and had shown that through their myriad of successful series. One, Yuichiro Takeda, who had, ironically enough, come into Takahashi's orbit as a direct result of Namco Bandai supporting Xenosaga through the creation of the first game's anime adaptation, as Takeda had written that adaptation as another in a long line of Bandai-sponsored or owned series he'd worked on, and had been read in on what the Xeno series was doing to know what to emphasize for audiences. Takeda had even worked with Nintendo IPs before, on the F-Zero Legends anime. But more importantly, more critically, Takahashi had been a fan of Takeda's own works in the past and even referenced them in Xenosaga itself, allowing him to respect the man enough to actually listen to him and his feedback. Now, what series was Takeda responsible for that would result in this consideration and acclaim? Yes, Yuichiro Takeda was one of the primary scribes to the Best Brave series, King of Braves Gao-Gaigar, as well as sibling series / spin-off Better Man, and was the primary scribe to both the sequel OVA, Gao-Gaigar Final, as well as the Gao-Gaigar vs. Better Man web novel and manga. For those who aren't aware of how impactful Gao-Gaigar is, well, let me put it in these terms for you all. The current list of most powerful mecha in all of fiction currently sits in this order: Mazinger Zero, the Getter Emperor, Transcendent Storming Ultimate Perfect King Oger, Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann, yes, it has been demoted to 4th at this point, and in 5th place is Final Gao-Gaigar. And Gao-Gaigar, as mentioned before, was the basis for the Urde Kaiser mecha seen throughout the Xenosaga games. Takahashi was already a fan of it. So of course he'd listened to Takeda when Takeda told Takahashi to follow the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. Well, that is not what Takeda specifically told Takahashi. It was in the same sentiment as I introduced back when I reviewed Xenogears. Takahashi kept overcomplicating his own stories, so they became absolutely terrible at explaining themselves, and as a consequence validating their plot points and diversions. And with no good explanation to relate to an audience and hinging their narratives on knowledge and material that was not present in the material itself, it made the stories he was telling become unnecessarily obtuse and impenetrable to easily understand to anyone without that supplementary information readily at hand, which, as presented already with Xenosaga, was harming their products on an international market because that supplementary material was never making its way outside of Japan in any official form. So whatever they were doing had to be something that could be presented within the games themselves or in an easily accessible means. And thus, as a result, this is how we got the XenoBlade series in the form it is now. XenoBlade Chronicles 1 released in 2010, in the tail end days of the Nintendo Wii. And it did decently, though it wasn't until Shulk made it into Super Smash Bros. 4 that many took a second look at his originating game to see it for what it was. A game with gigantic explorable and traversable overworlds on the Wii of all consoles. But even for that console, Xenoblade 1 looked better than anything Final Fantasy XIII did the previous year. Hell, considering how long it takes 13 to actually open up to Pulse, where it actually pretends to have an explorable world, only for it to once more shove you into a hallway, Xenoblade 1 is absolutely everything the 13 series claimed it wanted to be. Players and critics loved it, and Nintendo was happy to continue supporting the latest Xeno incarnation after its launch. While Xenoblade Chronicles Cross and its original Wii U version stumbled, partly because of the console and partly because it has a very steep difficulty curve, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 as one of the Nintendo Switch launch titles ensured the franchise's continued viability, with its Torna expansion released both digitally and as purchasable cartridge, adding greatly to its value, and in my opinion is the most well-told the series has been.
Red is the perfect one, black is the brooding bad boy, green is the clown, and yellow, well, she's the girl. So what are you supposed to be?
I'm Scottish!
With that in turn leading to Xenoblade 1's re-release on the console with its own expansion DLC story, Future Connected. And best of all, the Xenoblade series through its various entries finally rolled back around to what Takahashi originally wanted to present with Xenogears. A protagonist with psychological issues and even identity disorders that are worked through over the course of the narrative. Of wars between factions manipulated by third-party powers that the focus groups become an amalgamation of by drawing from those factions to end their conflicts for good. Of Gnostic reflections on the nature of entities claiming rights to divinity or authority only to be smacked down by others that actually bear such powers backing and strengthening the heroes. And unlike Xenosaga, the protagonist actually being in the proper positions, doing the right thing, and actually being allowed the proper, need-to-know information to make informed decisions, so the character's agency is not taken from them. The settings we explore feel like actual worlds we are allowed to explore and gain proper insight into. The combat of each game is actually good, favoring a more real-time system but with means of customization. We have supporting characters of varying types we can attach to, as well as small special moments indicated to have moments between them that give them greater value. Everything that wanted to be done, needed to be done, finally being able to be capitalized on. So the moments that need to hit the hardest actually finally connect to a broad, widely accepted player base. Xenogears failed its sales goals. Xenosaga 1 sold 1 million copies, but by Xenosaga 3 its sales were barely a third of that. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, on the other hand, has sold 2.7 million copies, all on its own, before Torna, outdoing every preceding Xeno game release of the Gears and Saga run, with the Blade games all together totaling over 9 million total sales as of 2025, before the re-release of Xenoblade Chronicles Cross will occur. Its success is something Monolith Soft, when it started, could have only dreamed of. And in turn, Xenoblade 3, as of its Future Redeemed DLC, bringing everything full circle. Takahashi finally getting to fulfill his earliest ambitions and promise he made with Xenogears, and again with Xenosaga. 6 games, 1 story. Or rather, as is the context of something of a mistake I made amidst releasing the Xenogears review, because that information was not available at the time I was making those videos. 6 games. 6 games. 1 story. Now, what that connotation has in store for the future of the franchise, whether that will play into the upcoming remaster of Xenoblade Chronicles Cross that will be looking to fix that game's unique issues, whether Xenosaga 1 through 3 will get a remaster itself with all the supplementary content included like CyberConnected with .hack.GU for Last Recode, or whether a presumptive Xenoblade 4 for the Nintendo Switch 2 will finally allow us to find out who the last of Rex's kids is, well, only one thing is certain right now. As of December of 2024, Nintendo 100% outright owns Monolith Soft. Bandai had been giving up their stake years ago. And all in all, being outright owned by the world's most consistently successful video game company, in a time where all of the brands are suffering from the consequences of en masse failure of numerous monetization schemes, where the industry is only a few steps away from collapse, and Nintendo's biggest current screw-ups are their terrible rate of old game remasters and re-releases, and not giving the Pokemon developers enough time to make each new Pokemon game. I adore Paldea, but it has legitimate complaints with some of the initial bugs that were patched. Well, there are worse conditions to be in. As much as I've contrasted Monolith Soft against CyberConnect in the negative throughout this video and found Monolith Soft wanting by comparison, at least Monolith Soft can claim they escaped from the hindrance Bandai can at times put on their developers that disappoint them and their other collaborators, IPs, and productions to limit their viability. So Monolith Soft can now make the games they want to, with the time available to do them right, and get the correct promotion to help them succeed. Whereas others, as meritable as their productions may be, just aren't being given those same advantages. Which is a shame, as when you vibe with what a company does, you want to see them do well, and not everyone's going to get the second, or even the third chances Takahashi and Monolift had handed to them. But at least we can see the fruit of them finally learning the lessons they needed to, in order for them to get their points across. I'm Shinta, and this discussion has gone on way too long for this new format. Check out our streams as we schedule them for most Fridays, try not to be an asshole in the chat, and we'll see you around.